The Marcomanni emerged from the dense forests and fertile river valleys of what is now central Germany during the tumultuous centuries preceding Roman expansion into Germanic territories. Their homeland lay primarily along the main river and its tributaries, a region that provided both natural defences and abundant resources for a warrior society that would eventually challenge Rome's northern frontier. Archaeological excavations throughout the main river valley have revealed extensive evidence of Marcomannic occupation dating to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The most significant discoveries come from sites near modern-day Würzburg, Bamberg, and along the upper reaches of the Main, where excavators have uncovered substantial settlement remains that demonstrate a sophisticated material culture. These settlements typically consisted of rectangular timber-framed houses with wattle and daub walls, measuring between 15 and 25 metres in length. The structures featured central hearths and storage areas, indicating both domestic life and surplus accumulation typical of emerging chieftain societies. The pottery assemblages from these sites reveal distinctive characteristics that set Marcomannic material culture apart from their neighbours. Their ceramics display a preference for angular, geometric decorations executed in fine incised lines, often forming intricate patterns of triangles, diamonds, and parallel grooves. Particularly notable are the large storage vessels, some reaching heights of 60 centimetres, decorated with horizontal bands of impressed chord markings and fingertip indentations. These vessels suggest not only advanced ceramic technology, but also the need to store substantial quantities of grain and other foodstuffs, indicating agricultural surplus and social stratification. Metalworking evidence from Marcomannic sites demonstrates sophisticated iron production capabilities. Bloomery furnaces discovered at several locations show consistent design features, with clay-lined shafts approximately 1 metre in height and carefully constructed bellows systems. The iron artefacts recovered include agricultural tools such as ploughshares, sickles and axes, alongside an impressive array of weapons and personal ornaments. Particularly significant are the iron spear points, which display distinctive socketed construction with reinforcing ribs, and long iron swords with pattern-welded blades showing advanced metallurgical techniques. The tribal name Marcomanni derives from 2 Germanic elements: marca, meaning border or march, and manus, meaning man or warrior. This etymology reveals crucial insights into their self-perception and role within the broader Germanic tribal landscape. As bordermen or march warriors, the Marcomanni occupied a liminal position both geographically and culturally, serving as frontier guardians along the edges of Suebi territory. This designation suggests they functioned as a buffer population, responsible for monitoring and defending against incursions from neighbouring tribes and eventually Roman forces. The linguistic evidence extends beyond mere etymology to encompass broader patterns of Germanic tribal nomenclature. Similar compound names appear throughout the region, such as the Cherusci and the Cimbri, indicating a common tradition of martial self-identification among Germanic peoples. However, the specific reference to border or march in the Marcomannic name suggests a particular military and administrative function within Suebi Confederation structures. Contemporary Roman sources, particularly Caesar's commentaries, reference the practice of Germanic tribes establishing march communities along contested frontiers, lending credibility to this interpretation. The social structure of early Marcomannic society emerges clearly through analysis of burial practices and grave goods dating to this period. Excavations at cemetery sites near Schweinfurt and Haßfurt have revealed a 3-tiered burial hierarchy that reflects emerging social stratification. Elite burials, comprising approximately 10% of interments, contain elaborate grave goods, including complete weapon sets, imported Roman bronze vessels, amber jewellery and occasionally gold ornaments. These wealthy graves typically feature wooden chamber construction with interior dimensions of 3 by 2 meters, surrounded by ditched enclosures that required substantial labour investment. Middle-tier burials, representing about 30% of the cemetery population, contain more modest assemblages focused on practical items and personal ornaments. These graves regularly include iron knives, bronze fibulae, ceramic vessels, and occasionally single weapons such as spears or shields. The burial chambers are simpler, usually consisting of wooden coffins without elaborate architectural features, though still demonstrating care in construction and placement. The remaining 60% of burials contain minimal grave goods, typically limited to basic pottery vessels and simple iron tools. However, even these modest interments show evidence of careful preparation and community involvement, suggesting that while social hierarchy existed, it did not extend to complete marginalization of lower status individuals. Weapon deposits discovered throughout Marcomannic territory provide additional evidence for warrior culture and ritual practices. At sites near Kitzingen and Ochsenfurt, archaeologists have uncovered deliberate depositions of weapons in wetland contexts, including complete shield bosses, spear points, and sword fragments. These deposits appear to represent ritual offerings rather than accidental losses, as the weapons show evidence of intentional destruction through bending and breaking before deposition. The practice aligns with broader Germanic traditions of weapon sacrifice, documented throughout Northern Europe during this period. The shield bosses from these deposits display characteristic Marcomannic design elements, featuring iron construction with bronze reinforcements and decorative studs arranged in geometric patterns. The shields themselves, reconstructed from surviving metal fittings and wood impressions, measured approximately 75 centimeters in diameter, with central grips and leather arm straps. Spear points show considerable variation in size and design, ranging from light javelins with leaf-shaped heads to heavy thrusting spears with angular armor-piercing points. Settlement patterns across Marcomannic territory reveal a preference for elevated positions overlooking river valleys, providing both defensive advantages and control over trade routes. The largest settlements, such as those discovered near Bamberg, encompass areas of 15 to 20 hectares and show evidence of planned layout with distinct residential, craft production and storage zones. These sites feature substantial timber palisades with entrance gates flanked by wooden towers, indicating organised defensive planning and community labour mobilisation. Craft production areas within settlements show specialisation in metalworking, pottery production and textile manufacture. Metalworking zones typically occupy peripheral locations due to fire hazards and contain multiple furnaces, anvils, and extensive slag deposits. Pottery workshops cluster near clay sources and feature large kilns capable of firing multiple vessels simultaneously. Textile production evidence includes loom weights, spindle whorls, and bone needles, suggesting household-level cloth production supplemented by specialised workshops for higher quality fabrics. The geographic distribution of Marcomannic settlements extends throughout the main river valley system, with the highest concentration occurring in the middle Main region, between modern Würzburg and Bamberg. Secondary settlement clusters appear along tributary valleys, particularly the Regnitz and Tauber rivers, where smaller communities of 2 to 5 hectares maintained connections to larger centres through established trail networks. Archaeological evidence suggests these smaller settlements specialised in particular economic activities such as iron ore extraction, livestock management, or agricultural surplus production. Relationships with neighbouring Suebi tribes emerge through analysis of material culture distributions and settlement patterns. The Hermunduri, located to the east along the Upper Elbe drainage, shared similar pottery traditions and metalworking techniques with the Marcomanni, suggesting regular contact and possible kinship connections. Archaeological assemblages from border zones between these territories show mixed characteristics, indicating either peaceful coexistence or gradual cultural blending through intermarriage and trade relationships. The Semnones, positioned to the north and northeast, maintained more distinct material culture traditions, though imported Marcomannic iron tools and weapons appear regularly in Semnone sites. This pattern suggests established trade networks that facilitated the exchange of specialized products while maintaining cultural boundaries. Roman sources later described these relationships as components of the broader Suebi Confederation, though archaeological evidence indicates that political unity developed gradually through existing economic and cultural connections. Interactions with the Chatti, located to the northwest, appear more complex and occasionally hostile. Settlement patterns along the watershed divide between main and Weser drainage systems show evidence of fortification and defensive positioning, suggesting periodic conflict over territorial boundaries or resource access. However, the presence of Chatti pottery styles in some Marcomannic sites indicates that conflict alternated with peaceful exchange, typical of Germanic tribal relationships during this period. The devastating Cimbrian Wars of 101 BC fundamentally altered the demographic and political landscape of Central Europe, creating a cascade of tribal movements that would reshape Germanic society for generations. The Cimbrian Teutones, massive tribal confederations from the Jutland Peninsula, had swept southward through Germanic territories like an unstoppable tide, displacing established populations and disrupting traditional territorial boundaries. Their initial victory over Roman forces at Nerea in 113 BC sent shockwaves throughout the region, demonstrating that even Rome's military might could be challenged by determined Germanic warriors. The Marcomanni found themselves directly in the path of this demographic upheaval. Archaeological evidence from sites along the main river shows clear signs of disruption during this period, with several major settlements experiencing sudden abandonment around 110 BC. Excavations at the Bamberg settlement complex reveal a layer of ash and debris dating to this time frame, followed by a distinct gap in occupation that lasted approximately 2 decades. Similar patterns appear at sites near Würzburg and Schweinfurt, suggesting a coordinated evacuation rather than gradual abandonment. The pressure from migrating populations forced the Marcomanni to make a critical decision that would define their next century of existence. Rather than remaining in their ancestral territories and facing potential annihilation or absorption by the Cimbrian host, Marcomannic leadership chose strategic withdrawal. This decision required abandoning established settlements, agricultural lands and sacred sites that had anchored their identity for generations. The migration represented not merely a tactical retreat, but a fundamental transformation of Marcomannic society, from settled agriculturalists to mobile warrior bands. Evidence for this westward movement appears in archaeological deposits along traditional migration routes through the Franconian highlands and into the Upper Rhine Valley. Distinctive Marcomannic pottery sherds and metalwork have been discovered at temporary campsites along the Tauber and Neckar river systems, indicating the migration route followed established waterways that provided both navigation markers and access to fresh water. These sites typically show brief occupation periods, with evidence of rapid shelter construction using portable materials and minimal investment in permanent structures. The migration brought the Marcomanni into contact with Ariovistus, a charismatic Suebi war leader who had already established himself as a dominant figure among the Germanic tribes west of the Rhine. Ariovistus represented a new type of Germanic leadership, combining traditional warrior culture with sophisticated political acumen and strategic vision. Unlike the hereditary chieftains who had previously governed Suebi tribes through kinship networks and ritual authority, Ariovistus built his power base through military success and the ability to coordinate multiple tribal groups toward common objectives. Roman sources describe Ariovistus as Rex Germanorum, though this title likely reflects Roman attempts to understand Germanic political structures through familiar terminology rather than accurate description of his actual authority. Germanic society lacked the centralized monarchical institutions that characterize Mediterranean civilizations, instead operating through complex networks of personal loyalty, kinship obligations, and warrior bands. Ariovistus functioned more as a supreme war leader or military coordinator, maintaining authority through continuous demonstration of martial prowess and successful leadership in battle. The Marcomanni's integration into Ariovistus's confederation occurred gradually through a series of military alliances and mutual support agreements. Initial contact likely took place around 108 BC, when Marcomannic refugees encountered Suebi forces already operating in the Upper Rhine region. Rather than viewing the Marcomanni as competitors or threats, Ariovistus recognized their value as experienced warriors familiar with Roman military tactics through their eastern territorial experiences. The Marcomanni brought crucial intelligence about Roman operational methods, having observed Roman forces during the later stages of the Cimbrian Wars. The confederation that emerged under Ariovistus's leadership represented a significant evolution in Germanic political organization. Previous Suebi alliances had typically formed around specific military objectives or seasonal raiding campaigns, dissolving once immediate goals were achieved. Ariovistus created a more durable structure that maintained tribal identity while coordinating strategic planning and resource allocation across multiple groups. The Marcomanni occupied a prominent position within this confederation, serving as elite shock troops and strategic advisors due to their military expertise and knowledge of Roman tactics. Archaeological evidence from sites in Alsace and the Upper Rhine Valley documents the establishment of Germanic settlements during this period. Excavations near Strasbourg and Colmar have revealed substantial fortified positions dating to approximately 190 BC, featuring characteristic Suebi construction techniques, combined with defensive innovations that suggest Roman influence. These settlements show evidence of planned layout with designated areas for weapon storage, horse corrals, and communal meeting spaces, indicating military rather than civilian priorities. The fortifications themselves demonstrate sophisticated understanding of siege warfare and defensive architecture. Timber palisades incorporate interlocking construction techniques that distribute impact forces across multiple structural elements, while entrance gates feature complex approach routes designed to expose attackers to concentrated missile fire. Interior layouts prioritize rapid mobilization, with weapon caches positioned for quick distribution and clear sight lines maintained between defensive positions. Settlement patterns reveal the Confederation's expansion strategy throughout the region. Rather than establishing a single major stronghold, Ariovistus's forces created a network of mutually supporting positions that could coordinate defensive efforts while maintaining operational flexibility. The Marcomanni typically occupied the most strategically critical sites, particularly those controlling river crossings and mountain passes that provided access to Gallic territories further west. The Confederation's expansion brought them into direct conflict with established Gallic tribes, particularly the Sequani and Aedui, who had dominated eastern Gaul for centuries. The Sequani, whose territory encompassed much of modern-day Franche-Comté and portions of Burgundy, initially welcomed Germanic military assistance in their ongoing conflicts with the Aedui. This decision would prove catastrophic for Sequani independence, as Ariovistus's forces quickly transformed from hired mercenaries into occupying conquerors. The initial arrangement between the Sequani and Germanic Confederation appeared mutually beneficial. The Sequani gained access to experienced warriors who could tip the balance in their favour against Aedui expansion, while Ariovistus's forces secured legitimate justification for establishing permanent settlements west of the Rhine. The agreement, negotiated around 72 BC, granted the Germanic Confederation rights to approximately 1/3 of Sequani territory in exchange for military support and protection against Aedui aggression. However, the reality of Germanic occupation quickly exceeded Sequani expectations. Rather than maintaining discrete military camps, the Confederation began establishing permanent settlements with extensive agricultural operations and craft production facilities. Archaeological evidence from sites near Besancon and Vesoul shows rapid construction of substantial Germanic settlements, featuring characteristic timber-framed architecture and defensive earthworks. These settlements housed not only warriors but entire family groups, indicating long-term colonization rather than temporary military deployment. The Marcomanni played a crucial role in this territorial expansion, utilizing their organizational skills and military experience to coordinate settlement establishment and defensive preparations. Their knowledge of Roman engineering techniques proved particularly valuable in constructing fortifications capable of withstanding professional siege warfare. Several sites show evidence of Marcomannic influence in their defensive design, featuring complex gate systems and overlapping fields of fire that reflect Roman military principles adapted for Germanic construction methods. Tensions escalated rapidly as the true scope of Germanic territorial ambitions became apparent. The Confederation demanded additional land grants, eventually claiming 2/3 of Sequani territory, while simultaneously pressuring neighbouring tribes for similar concessions. The Aedui, recognizing the existential threat posed by Germanic expansion, abandoned their conflict with the Sequani and sought external assistance to expel the invaders. The political dynamics of Eastern Gaul during this period reflected the complex web of tribal alliances and rivalries that characterized pre-Roman Celtic society. The Aedui had traditionally maintained friendly relations with Rome, having provided assistance during various military campaigns and receiving recognition as Amici Populi Romani. This relationship provided them with diplomatic channels to request Roman intervention against Germanic expansion, though initial Roman responses remained limited to diplomatic protests and economic pressure. The situation deteriorated further when Ariovistus began recruiting additional Germanic tribes from across the Rhine, promising them shares of conquered Gallic territory in exchange for military service. Archaeological evidence suggests that substantial numbers of Harudes Marcomanni, Tribocci, Vangiones, Nemetes, Sedusii, and Suebi crossed into Gaul during this period, creating a demographic pressure that threatened to overwhelm existing Gallic populations entirely. The Marcomanni's position within this expanding confederation remained secure due to their proven military capabilities and strategic value. Roman sources indicate that Marcomannic warriors served as elite units within Ariovistus's army, typically deployed at critical points during major engagements. Their reputation for disciplined fighting and tactical flexibility made them particularly effective against Gallic warrior bands, who relied primarily on individual courage and clan loyalty rather than coordinated battlefield maneuvers. The Confederation's military success stemmed partly from its ability to combine traditional Germanic warrior culture with tactical innovations learned through contact with Mediterranean civilizations. The Marcomanni contributed significantly to this military evolution, introducing formation fighting techniques and coordinated cavalry operations that enhanced overall battlefield effectiveness. Their experience with Roman military methods proved invaluable in developing countermeasures against professional legionary tactics. By 60 BC, Germanic control extended throughout much of eastern Gaul, with Ariovistus exercising effective authority over territories stretching from the Vosges Mountains to the Saône River Valley. The Confederation had successfully established a Germanic kingdom west of the Rhine, creating a precedent that would influence tribal migration patterns for decades to come. The Marcomanni found themselves in an unprecedented position of power and influence, controlling substantial territories and commanding respect throughout the Germanic world. However, this success inevitably attracted Roman attention as reports of Germanic expansion reached the Senate and Julius Caesar, who was preparing to assume his proconsular command in Gaul. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test Germanic military capabilities against Roman professional armies and determine whether the Confederation's territorial gains could be maintained against determined Roman opposition. The catastrophic defeat at Vosges in 58 BC shattered the Germanic Confederation that had dominated eastern Gaul for over a decade. Caesar's legions, employing superior discipline and tactical coordination, systematically dismantled Ariovistus's forces in a single decisive engagement that demonstrated the overwhelming advantages of professional Roman military organization over traditional Germanic warrior bands. The battle's aftermath left thousands of Germanic warriors dead on the battlefield, while survivors scattered in desperate flight back across the Rhine, abandoning their settlements, families, and territorial ambitions in Gaul. For the Marcomanni, the defeat represented more than military failure. It marked the complete collapse of their strategic position west of the Rhine and forced a fundamental re-evaluation of their relationship with Roman power. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Germanic settlements in Alsace shows hasty evacuation during this period, with valuable items left behind and storage facilities deliberately destroyed to prevent Roman exploitation. Sites near Strasbourg and Colmar reveal layers of ash and debris dating to 57 BC, indicating systematic destruction of Germanic infrastructure as survivors retreated eastward. The retreat across the Rhine occurred under chaotic conditions, with surviving Confederation members competing for limited river crossing points, while Roman cavalry pursued stragglers. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of desperation as Germanic families attempted to salvage essential possessions while maintaining sufficient mobility to escape Roman retaliation. The Marcomanni, despite their elite status within the Confederation, found themselves reduced to refugee status alongside common warriors and civilian populations. During this crisis, a young Marcomannic nobleman named Maroboduus emerged as a unifying figure capable of transforming defeat into strategic opportunity. Born into the tribal aristocracy around 30 BC, Maroboduus had spent his formative years within Ariovistus's confederation, gaining extensive exposure to both Germanic warrior traditions and Roman military methods. His education encompassed not only traditional martial skills, but also diplomatic protocols, strategic planning, and the administrative techniques necessary for governing diverse tribal populations. Maroboduus possessed qualities that distinguished him from typical Germanic war leaders of his generation. Rather than relying solely on personal combat prowess and charismatic authority, he demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political organization and long-term strategic planning. His ability to analyze complex military situations and develop comprehensive responses reflected intellectual capabilities that would prove crucial in navigating the challenges facing Germanic tribes in the post-Gallic War period. The young leader's rise to prominence occurred gradually through a series of calculated moves that demonstrated both military competence and political acumen. Following the Confederation's collapse, Maroboduus gathered surviving Marcomannic warriors and their families, organizing them into disciplined columns capable of sustained movement across hostile territory. His leadership during the retreat earned respect from veterans who had served under Ariovistus, establishing the personal loyalty networks essential for Germanic political authority. By 15 BC, Maroboduus had consolidated sufficient support among Marcomannic survivors to challenge existing tribal leadership structures. The traditional chiefs who had governed Marcomannic society before the Gallic adventure had either died in battle or lost credibility through their association with the failed confederation. Maroboduus filled this leadership vacuum by demonstrating superior organizational skills and presenting a coherent vision for Marcomannic recovery and future prosperity. His assumption of royal authority around 9 BC marked a decisive break with traditional Germanic political practices. Rather than accepting the consensus-based leadership typical of Germanic tribes, Maroboduus established centralized control that concentrated military, judicial and religious authority in his person. This transformation required careful management of tribal traditionalists who viewed monarchical government as incompatible with Germanic customs, but Maroboduus successfully argued that extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. The new king's first major strategic decision involved territorial relocation to Bohemia, a region that offered significant advantages over the Marcomanni's traditional main river homeland. Bohemia's geographic position provided natural defensive barriers through the Bohemian Massif's mountain ranges, while the Elbe River system offered access to northern European trade networks. The region's agricultural potential exceeded that of the main valley, with extensive fertile plains capable of supporting larger populations and generating substantial surplus production. Archaeological evidence documents the Marcomannic migration into Bohemia through distinctive pottery assemblages and metalwork styles that appear suddenly in the archaeological record around 8 BC. Excavations at sites near modern Prague reveal the establishment of substantial settlements featuring characteristic Marcomannic timber-framed architecture adapted for local environmental conditions. These early Bohemian settlements show evidence of planned construction with designated areas for craft production, weapon storage, and administrative functions. The migration process required complex logistical coordination to move entire tribal populations across several hundred kilometers of potentially hostile territory. Maroboduus organised the movement in stages, establishing temporary camps along established river routes, while advance parties secured crossing points and negotiated passage rights with local populations. The operation's success demonstrated his exceptional organisational capabilities and established his reputation as a leader capable of achieving seemingly impossible objectives. Upon reaching Bohemia, Maroboduus began implementing a comprehensive territorial organisation strategy that would transform the region into the foundation of Germanic power in Central Europe. His capital, established near the confluence of the Vltava and Elbe rivers, approximately 15 kilometers north of modern Prague, occupied a naturally defensible position on elevated terrain, overlooking major transportation routes. The site provided excellent visibility across the surrounding countryside, while offering multiple escape routes in case of siege. The capital's construction reflected Maroboduus's sophisticated understanding of urban planning and defensive architecture. Excavations have revealed a complex of timber-framed buildings arranged around central courtyards, with specialized structures for administrative functions, weapon production, and religious ceremonies. The royal residence itself measured approximately 40 by 25 meters, featuring multiple rooms with elaborate interior decorations including carved wooden panels and bronze fittings imported from Roman territories. Defensive preparations around the capital incorporated both Germanic construction techniques and Roman engineering principles learned during the Gallic campaigns. The primary fortification consisted of a timber palisade reinforced with earthwork ramparts, featuring sophisticated gate systems with overlapping approach routes designed to expose attackers to concentrated missile fire. Interior defensive positions included elevated platforms for archers and storage facilities for siege supplies, indicating preparation for extended defensive operations. The kingdom's territorial organisation extended throughout Bohemia through a network of secondary settlements and fortified positions that provided administrative control and military coordination across the region. Archaeological surveys have identified over 30 substantial sites dating to Maroboduus's reign, ranging from major population centres housing several thousand inhabitants to smaller military outposts controlling strategic river crossings and mountain passes. This settlement network demonstrated unprecedented organisational sophistication for Germanic society of this period. Maroboduus's military reforms represented perhaps his most significant innovation, fundamentally transforming Marcomannic warfare from traditional Germanic methods to a hybrid system combining Roman tactical discipline with Germanic warrior culture. The king recognized that future conflicts with Rome would require military capabilities far exceeding those of typical tribal warbands, necessitating systematic reorganization of Marcomannic armed forces along more professional lines. The reformed army retained traditional Germanic elements, including individual warrior prowess, clan-based unit organization, and emphasis on personal loyalty to military leaders. However, Maroboduus introduced Roman-influenced innovations such as standardized equipment, coordinated formation fighting, and systematic training programs that enhanced overall military effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits near the capital reveals standardized spear points, shield bosses, and sword designs that indicate centralized production and distribution systems. Training facilities established throughout the kingdom provided systematic instruction in both traditional Germanic combat methods and Roman-influenced tactical formations. These installations, identified through archaeological excavation, featured practice areas for individual weapons training, larger spaces for formation drills, and specialized facilities for cavalry operations. The comprehensive nature of these training programs reflected Maroboduus's commitment to creating military forces capable of competing with Roman legions on equal terms. Equipment standardization represented a significant departure from traditional Germanic practices, where individual warriors typically provided their own weapons and armor according to personal preferences and economic capabilities. Maroboduus established centralized production facilities that manufactured standardized weapons distributed to warriors according to their military roles and unit assignments. This system ensured consistent quality while reducing logistical complications during military campaigns. The reformed military structure incorporated Roman organizational principles while maintaining Germanic cultural elements essential for warrior morale and unit cohesion. Infantry formations combined Roman-style shield walls and coordinated movement with Germanic emphasis on individual combat skills and aggressive offensive tactics. Cavalry units, traditionally the elite component of Germanic armies, received enhanced training in coordinated charge techniques and battlefield communication methods that improved their tactical effectiveness. Despite these military innovations, Maroboduus carefully preserved essential elements of Germanic warrior culture that provided psychological motivation and social cohesion within his forces. Traditional ceremonies marking warrior initiation, weapon consecration, and victory celebration continued according to established customs, while clan-based unit organization maintained kinship bonds that enhanced battlefield loyalty and coordination. This careful balance between innovation and tradition proved crucial for maintaining military effectiveness while preserving cultural identity. The kingdom's diplomatic relations with Rome developed through a complex process of negotiation and mutual recognition that reflected both powers' strategic interests in maintaining stability along the Danube frontier. Augustus, having completed the conquest of Gaul and initiated campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Rhine, recognized that Maroboduus's kingdom represented both a potential threat and a valuable buffer against more hostile tribes further north and east. Initial diplomatic contact occurred around 6 BC when Roman envoys reached Maroboduus's capital to assess the kingdom's military capabilities and political intentions. These negotiations, conducted according to established Roman diplomatic protocols, resulted in a formal agreement that recognized Marcomannic territorial claims in Bohemia while establishing tribute obligations and military cooperation arrangements. The agreement represented a significant diplomatic achievement for Maroboduus, providing international recognition of his kingdom's legitimacy while avoiding direct military confrontation with Rome. The tribute arrangements negotiated with Rome involved annual payments of valuable goods, including amber, furs, iron products, and occasionally Germanic warriors for auxiliary military service. These payments, while representing a form of subordination to Roman authority, provided the kingdom with access to Roman markets and diplomatic protection against hostile neighbours. Archaeological evidence from the capital shows increased quantities of Roman luxury goods during this period, indicating the economic benefits derived from diplomatic cooperation. Military cooperation agreements established protocols for coordinating defensive operations along the Danube frontier, with Marcomannic forces serving as an early warning system against tribal migrations and raiding expeditions from the north. This arrangement provided Rome with valuable intelligence about Germanic tribal movements, while giving Maroboduus's kingdom a legitimate role in regional security arrangements. The cooperation proved mutually beneficial, as Roman military support helped stabilise Marcomannic territorial claims against competing tribal groups. The delicate balance of power along the Danube frontier required continuous diplomatic management as both Roman and Germanic interests evolved over time. Maroboduus maintained careful neutrality in Roman internal conflicts while gradually expanding his influence among neighbouring Germanic tribes through diplomatic alliances and strategic marriages. This expansion created tension with Roman authorities, who viewed growing Germanic unity as a potential threat to frontier security, but Maroboduus successfully managed these concerns through regular diplomatic communication and demonstrations of continued cooperation. The diplomatic equilibrium that Maroboduus had carefully cultivated with Rome provided the foundation for unprecedented territorial expansion throughout Central Europe during the first decade AD. His kingdom's strategic position in Bohemia, combined with its growing military reputation and Roman recognition, attracted numerous Germanic tribes seeking protection from Roman expansion along the Rhine frontier and political stability in an increasingly volatile regional environment. The Marcomannic court became a magnet for tribal delegations offering submission in exchange for military protection and inclusion in what was rapidly becoming the most powerful Germanic political entity north of the Danube. The Quadi, occupying the fertile Moravian plains east of Bohemia, were among the first major tribes to formally acknowledge Marcomannic supremacy. Their territory encompassed the strategic Morava River valley, which provided crucial access to Danubian trade routes and served as a natural corridor between Bohemian highlands and the Hungarian plains. Archaeological evidence from Quadi settlements near modern Brno and Olomouc shows sudden appearance of Marcomannic-style pottery and metalwork around 5 AD, indicating rapid cultural integration following political submission. The Quadi leadership retained local autonomy over internal tribal affairs while accepting Marcomannic authority in matters of external relations, military coordination, and territorial disputes with neighbouring groups. The incorporation of Quadi territory nearly doubled the kingdom's agricultural capacity and provided access to extensive iron ore deposits in the Moravian highlands. These mineral resources proved particularly valuable for supporting the kingdom's expanding military requirements, as standardized weapon production demanded consistent supplies of high-quality iron. Excavations at metalworking sites near Brno reveal substantial increases in production capacity during this period, with new furnace complexes capable of processing larger quantities of ore, using improved smelting techniques that combined Germanic traditions with Roman engineering principles. Slovak territories along the upper Danube tributaries gradually fell under Marcomannic influence through a combination of diplomatic pressure and strategic military demonstrations. The diverse tribal groups occupying this region, including segments of the Cotini, Osi, and various smaller Celtic communities, lacked the political cohesion necessary to resist Marcomannic expansion effectively. Rather than attempting direct conquest, which would have required extensive military resources and risked Roman intervention, Maroboduus employed sophisticated diplomatic strategies that gradually incorporated these territories through negotiated agreements and marriage alliances. The Cotini, who controlled valuable salt production facilities in the Carpathian foothills, proved particularly important for the kingdom's economic development. Salt represented one of the most valuable trade commodities in Central Europe. essential for food preservation and leather processing, while serving as a medium of exchange in regions lacking standardized coinage. Marcomannic control over Cutini salt production provided significant revenue streams that funded military expansion and administrative development throughout the kingdom. Archaeological evidence from salt production sites shows increased output during this period, with new extraction techniques and expanded transportation networks that facilitated distribution across Germanic territories. The kingdom's northern expansion encountered more substantial resistance from established Suebi tribal groups who viewed Marcomannic growth as a threat to their traditional territorial claims and political independence. The Semnones, occupying extensive territories between the Elbe and Oder rivers, possessed sufficient military strength and political organisation to challenge Marcomannic expansion directly. Their resistance required Maroboduus to demonstrate his kingdom's military capabilities through carefully planned campaigns that showcased Marcomannic tactical superiority, while avoiding prolonged conflicts that might attract Roman attention or deplete royal resources. The campaign against Semnones' resistance unfolded during the winter months of 3-2 AD, when reduced agricultural demands allowed maximum military mobilization without compromising food production. Maroboduus assembled approximately 15,000 warriors from Marcomannic core territories and allied tribes, organizing them into coordinated formations that combined traditional Germanic shock tactics with Roman-influenced tactical discipline. The army's composition reflected the kingdom's multi-tribal character, with Marcomannic veterans serving as elite units, while allied contingents provided specialized capabilities such as cavalry operations and siege warfare. The decisive engagement occurred near the confluence of the Elbe and Saale rivers, where Semnones' forces had established defensive positions designed to exploit their superior knowledge of local terrain. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of Marcomannic military reforms, as coordinated infantry formations systematically dismantled Semnones' defensive lines, while cavalry units prevented enemy withdrawal. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield, identified through metal detector surveys and excavation of weapon deposits, reveals the extensive scale of the engagement and confirms contemporary accounts of Marcomannic tactical superiority. Following their military defeat, Semnones' leadership accepted tributary status while maintaining internal autonomy under Marcomannic oversight. This arrangement became the standard model for incorporating resistant tribes into the expanding kingdom, providing sufficient control to ensure loyalty while avoiding the administrative burdens associated with direct governance. The tributary system generated substantial revenue streams through annual payments of livestock, agricultural products, manufactured goods, and military service obligations that strengthened the kingdom's overall capabilities. The systematic incorporation of subject tribes created unprecedented administrative challenges that required fundamental innovations in Germanic governmental practices. Traditional tribal leadership operated through personal relationships, kinship networks, and consensus-based decision-making that proved inadequate for governing diverse populations across extensive territories. Maroboduus developed sophisticated administrative structures that combined Germanic cultural elements with organizational principles derived from Roman governmental models, creating hybrid institutions capable of managing complex multi-tribal political entities. The royal court evolved into a sophisticated administrative centre, housing specialised officials responsible for military coordination, diplomatic relations, tribute collection, and judicial administration. Archaeological excavations at the capital have revealed extensive administrative complexes featuring standardised record-keeping facilities, secure storage areas for tribute goods, and specialised workshops for producing official documents and royal regalia. These facilities demonstrate organisational sophistication that rivaled contemporary Roman provincial administration, while maintaining distinctively Germanic cultural characteristics, Provincial governance throughout the kingdom operated through appointed officials who combined traditional Germanic leadership roles with administrative responsibilities derived from Roman models. These governors, typically drawn from Marcomannic nobility or allied tribal leadership, maintained royal authority in distant territories while adapting central policies to local conditions and cultural preferences. The system required careful balance between centralized control and regional autonomy, as excessive interference in local affairs risked triggering rebellions that could destabilize the entire kingdom. The tribute system that financed royal administration and military expansion operated through carefully calibrated assessments based on each territory's economic capacity and strategic importance. Agricultural regions provided grain, livestock, and manufactured goods, while territories controlling mineral resources contributed iron, salt, and precious metals. Military obligations varied according to tribal martial traditions and strategic requirements, with some groups providing infantry levies while others specialized in cavalry operations or siege warfare techniques. Economic development throughout the kingdom accelerated dramatically as political unification eliminated internal barriers to trade and resource allocation. The amber trade, which had traditionally operated through fragmented networks controlled by individual tribes, became systematized under royal oversight that coordinated production, transportation, and marketing across extensive geographic regions. Archaeological evidence from amber working sites shows substantial increases in production volume and quality during this period, with specialized workshops producing standardized products designed for specific market segments. The amber routes that connected Baltic production areas with Mediterranean markets passed directly through Marcomannic territory, providing the kingdom with opportunities to levy transit taxes while offering protection services to merchant caravans. These arrangements generated substantial revenue streams that funded infrastructure development, military expansion, and diplomatic activities throughout the region. Roman merchants operating along these routes reported increased security and reduced transportation costs compared to previous arrangements, indicating the effectiveness of royal protection services. Roman luxury goods began appearing in significant quantities throughout the kingdom, as diplomatic relations provided access to Mediterranean markets and tribute obligations were partially fulfilled through currency payments. Archaeological assemblages from elite burial sites dating to this period contain Roman bronze vessels, glass beads, wine amphorae, and occasionally silver coins that demonstrate growing economic integration with Roman commercial networks. The distribution patterns of these luxury items reveal social hierarchies within the kingdom, with highest concentrations appearing at the royal capital and major administrative centres. The adoption of Roman coinage for certain commercial transactions represented a significant innovation in Germanic economic practices, which had traditionally relied on barter systems and commodity exchange. While the kingdom never developed independent minting capabilities, Roman denarii and aureus circulated alongside traditional exchange media in major commercial centres. This monetary adoption facilitated long-distance trade while demonstrating the kingdom's integration into broader European economic systems. Military strength reached unprecedented levels as the kingdom's territorial expansion provided access to larger population bases and improved resource extraction capabilities. Contemporary Roman sources, particularly Tacitus's detailed military assessments, estimated total Marcomannic military potential at approximately 70,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, figures that represented the largest Germanic military force north of the Danube. These numbers reflected not only the kingdom's demographic growth but also systematic military organisation that maximised warrior recruitment and training efficiency. The infantry forces combined traditional Germanic warrior bands with reformed units trained according to Roman tactical principles. Core Marcomannic regiments, numbering approximately 20,000 warriors, received extensive training in formation fighting, coordinated movement, and siege warfare techniques that enhanced their battlefield effectiveness against both Germanic tribal forces and Roman legionary units. Allied tribal contingents provided additional manpower while maintaining their traditional fighting methods, creating tactical flexibility that adapted to diverse combat situations. Cavalry operations represented the kingdom's most distinctive military capability, as Germanic horse-breeding traditions, combined with improved training methods, produced mounted units capable of competing with Roman auxiliary cavalry. The 4,000 cavalry forces included both heavy cavalry equipped with long spears and mail armour for shock combat, and light cavalry specialised in reconnaissance, harassment, and pursuit operations. Archaeological evidence from horse burial sites reveals selective breeding programs that produced larger, stronger mounts capable of carrying fully equipped warriors in sustained combat operations. Weapon standardization throughout the military reflected centralized production systems that ensured consistent quality while reducing logistical complications during extended campaigns. Archaeological assemblages from weapon caches show standardized spear points measuring 30 centimeters in length with reinforced sockets, shield bosses featuring uniform bronze reinforcement patterns, and long swords with pattern-welded blades demonstrating advanced metallurgical techniques. This standardization represented a significant departure from traditional Germanic practices, where individual warriors provided their own equipment according to personal preferences and economic capabilities. Diplomatic relationships with Rome evolved into complex negotiations that reflected both powers' recognition of mutual strategic interests along the Danube frontier. The initial tributary arrangements established during Augustus's reign provided a foundation for ongoing diplomatic communication, but changing political circumstances in both kingdoms required continuous adjustment of agreements and obligations. Maroboduus maintained careful neutrality during Roman succession crises, while gradually expanding his influence among neighbouring tribes, creating tension that required sophisticated diplomatic management to prevent military confrontation. The diplomatic exchanges of 6 AD involved extensive negotiations over territorial boundaries, tribute obligations, and military cooperation arrangements, as Roman campaigns in Germania required Marcomannic cooperation for logistical support and intelligence gathering. These discussions, conducted through formal embassy exchanges, resulted in modified agreements that increased the kingdom's tribute obligations while providing greater autonomy in internal affairs and territorial expansion. The negotiations demonstrated Maroboduus's sophisticated understanding of Roman political processes and his ability to navigate complex diplomatic situations effectively. Roman recognition of the kingdom's legitimacy provided crucial international standing that facilitated diplomatic relations with other European powers and enhanced the kingdom's ability to attract tribal allies. This recognition, formalized through official treaties and ceremonial exchanges, established precedents for Romano-Germanic diplomatic relations that influenced frontier policy for subsequent decades. The kingdom's diplomatic success demonstrated that Germanic political entities could achieve international recognition through sophisticated negotiation rather than military confrontation alone. The delicate balance of power that Maroboduus had maintained through diplomatic finesse and military prowess began showing signs of strain as early as 15 AD, when mounting tensions within the Marcomannic nobility revealed fundamental contradictions in his centralized governing system. The king's authoritarian approach, while effective for rapid territorial expansion and military organization, had gradually alienated traditional tribal leaders who viewed monarchical power as incompatible with Germanic customs of consensus-based leadership and warrior democracy. These internal divisions created opportunities for ambitious rivals to challenge royal authority, while exploiting popular discontent among warriors who felt excluded from the kingdom's growing prosperity. Catualda emerged as the most formidable opposition leader during this period of internal discord. Born into the Marcomannic nobility around 25 BC, he'd spent his youth within the traditional tribal structure before Maroboduus' rise to power, developing strong connections with conservative factions who opposed the kingdom's Roman-influenced administrative innovations. His family lineage traced back to pre-migration Marcomannic chieftains who had governed through kinship networks and warrior assemblies, providing him with legitimate claims to leadership that resonated with traditionalist supporters throughout the kingdom. The factional struggles that erupted around 17 AD reflected deeper cultural tensions between modernizing and traditionalist elements within Marcomannic society. Catualda's supporters included veteran warriors who had served under Ariovistus, tribal priests who opposed the adoption of Roman governmental practices, and regional chieftains whose authority had been diminished by centralized administration. These groups shared common opposition to Maroboduus' monarchical system, while advocating for return to traditional Germanic political structures that emphasized collective decision-making and distributed leadership authority. Archaeological evidence from settlements throughout the kingdom reveals material culture changes that reflect these political divisions. Sites associated with Catualda's supporters show deliberate rejection of Roman-influenced artifacts and architectural styles, with construction projects reverting to traditional Germanic building techniques and decorative motifs. Pottery assemblages from these locations display increased emphasis on indigenous design elements, while metalwork shows revival of pre-kingdom stylistic traditions that had been gradually displaced by standardized royal production systems. The opposition movement gained momentum through systematic exploitation of economic grievances that had developed as consequences of the kingdom's tributary obligations to Rome. While royal administration had successfully managed tribute payments without significantly burdening core Marcomannic territories, allied tribes and peripheral regions experienced increasing taxation pressure as the kingdom's diplomatic commitments expanded. Catualda capitalized on this discontent by promising tax reduction and greater local autonomy under traditional tribal governance structures. Regional assemblies organized by opposition leaders provided forums for expressing grievances against royal policies while coordinating resistance activities throughout the kingdom. These gatherings, conducted according to ancient Germanic customs that required consensus among participating warriors, offered stark contrast to Maroboduus' administrative methods that concentrated decision-making authority in royal officials. The assembly's democratic character attracted supporters who felt marginalized by centralized government, while providing organizational structure for coordinating anti-royal activities. Military preparations by both factions created dangerous instability throughout the kingdom, as competing loyalty networks divided tribal units and undermined command structures that had previously ensured effective coordination. Royal forces retained advantages in equipment standardization and tactical training, but opposition supporters possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and population centers that facilitated guerrilla operations against royal administration. The resulting military standoff prevented either faction from achieving decisive victory, while creating conditions that invited external intervention. During this period of internal Marcomannic turmoil, Arminius had been developing his own ambitious plans for unifying Germanic tribes against Roman expansion along the Rhine frontier. The Cherushi war leader, having achieved legendary status through his victory over Varus at the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, recognized that sustainable resistance to Roman power required coordination among major Germanic political entities. His diplomatic initiatives aimed at creating a comprehensive anti-Roman alliance that would combine Cherusi military experience with Marcomannic organizational capabilities and territorial resources. Arminius's strategic vision encompassed the establishment of a Germanic confederation capable of challenging Roman hegemony throughout Central Europe, while maintaining sufficient internal cohesion to prevent the factional disputes that had historically undermined tribal unity. His analysis of Roman military capabilities convinced him that successful resistance required unprecedented cooperation among traditionally independent Germanic tribes, necessitating diplomatic agreements that transcended historical rivalries and territorial disputes. The Marcomannic kingdom represented the most crucial potential ally due to its military strength, territorial extent, and established governmental institutions. Initial diplomatic contact between Arminius and Maroboduus occurred through intermediary tribes during the winter of 1617 AD, when reduced military activity along the Rhine frontier provided opportunities for extended negotiations. The discussions revealed fundamental differences in strategic priorities and political objectives that complicated alliance formation, despite shared opposition to Roman expansion. Arminius advocated aggressive military campaigns designed to expel Roman forces from all Germanic territories, while Maroboduus preferred defensive strategies that preserved his kingdom's territorial integrity without risking catastrophic military defeat. The negotiations exposed deeper philosophical divisions regarding appropriate relationships with Roman power. Arminius viewed any accommodation with Rome as incompatible with Germanic independence and cultural integrity, arguing that tributary arrangements inevitably led to complete subordination and eventual absorption into Roman provincial systems. Maroboduus countered that pragmatic diplomacy provided greater security and prosperity than perpetual warfare, pointing to his kingdom's territorial expansion and economic development as evidence of successful coexistence strategies. Cultural differences between Cherushi and Marcomannic societies further complicated alliance negotiations. The Cherushi had maintained traditional tribal organization throughout the Roman period, preserving warrior democracy and consensus-based leadership that aligned with Arminius's political philosophy. The Marcomannic kingdom's centralized administration and Roman-influenced governmental practices appeared to many Cherushi as evidence of cultural contamination that undermined Germanic authenticity. These perceptions created suspicion among Arminius's supporters regarding Marcomannic commitment to genuine Germanic independence. Military coordination between the two powers proved equally problematic due to incompatible tactical doctrines and organizational structures. Cherushi forces specialized in guerrilla warfare and forest fighting techniques that exploited intimate knowledge of local terrain while avoiding direct confrontation with Roman legionary formations. Marcomannic military reforms had developed capabilities for conventional battlefield operations and siege warfare that required different strategic approaches and logistical support systems. Attempts to coordinate joint operations revealed these tactical incompatibilities while highlighting the challenges of integrating diverse military traditions. The failure of diplomatic cooperation became evident during 18 AD when simultaneous crises prevented effective coordination between potential allies. Arminius faced increasing opposition from pro-Roman factions within Cherushi territory, including his own uncle Inguiomerus, who advocated accommodation with Roman authority rather than continued resistance. Meanwhile, Catualda's rebellion against Maroboduus reached critical intensity, forcing the Marcomannic king to concentrate military resources on internal security rather than external alliance obligations. These parallel internal conflicts demonstrated the fundamental weakness of Germanic political structures when confronted with sustained Roman pressure and internal factional disputes. Both leaders found themselves fighting defensive battles against domestic opponents while attempting to maintain external diplomatic initiatives, creating strategic overextension that prevented effective response to Roman manipulation of Germanic internal divisions. Roman intelligence networks, operating through tribal contacts and diplomatic channels, successfully exploited these vulnerabilities by providing selective support to opposition factions. The collapse of potential Arminius-Maroboduus cooperation represented a crucial turning point in Germanic resistance to Roman expansion. Without coordinated leadership among major tribal powers, individual Germanic groups remained vulnerable to Roman military pressure and diplomatic manipulation that prevented formation of effective anti-Roman coalitions. The failure established patterns of Germanic disunity that would persist throughout subsequent decades, enabling Roman frontier control through divide-and-conquer strategies that exploited tribal rivalries and internal conflicts. Catualda's rebellion reached a decisive phase during the spring of 19 AD when accumulated grievances and factional tensions erupted into open civil war throughout the Marcomannic kingdom. The conflict began with coordinated attacks on royal administrative centres and tribute collection facilities, indicating sophisticated planning and extensive organisational preparation by opposition forces. Archaeological evidence from sites near modern Prague shows destruction layers dating to this period, with deliberate targeting of governmental buildings and royal storage facilities, while residential areas remained largely undamaged. The rebellion's initial success stemmed from widespread popular support among tribal groups who had experienced increasing taxation and administrative interference under centralised royal government. Catualda's forces included substantial numbers of allied tribal warriors who viewed the civil war as an opportunity to regain traditional autonomy while reducing tribute obligations to both the royal administration and Rome. Regional chieftains provided local knowledge and logistical support that enabled rapid movement across familiar territory while avoiding royal military concentrations. Military operations during the Civil War revealed the kingdom's internal divisions while demonstrating tactical innovations that both factions had developed during the conflict. Royal forces retained advantages in standardized equipment and coordinated formations, but opposition supporters utilized guerrilla tactics and local support networks that neutralized these advantages in familiar terrain. The resulting military stalemate prevented decisive victory by either faction, while creating conditions that attracted external intervention by neighbouring powers seeking to exploit Marcomannic weakness. Roman diplomatic activity during the Civil War reflected careful calculation of imperial interests along the Danube frontier. While Maroboduus's kingdom had provided valuable buffer protection against northern tribal migrations, internal instability threatened to create power vacuum that might encourage hostile tribal movements toward Roman territories. Roman officials maintained communication with both factions while avoiding direct military intervention that might unite Germanic opposition against common external threat. This diplomatic strategy aimed at ensuring favourable outcome regardless of which faction achieved ultimate victory. The decisive confrontation occurred near the royal capital when Catualda's forces, reinforced by Suebi allies from across the Elbe, launched coordinated assault on Maroboduus's primary stronghold. The battle demonstrated tactical evolution that had occurred during the Civil War, with both sides employing siege warfare techniques and coordinated infantry operations that reflected Roman military influence. However, superior numbers and local support enabled Catualda's forces to overwhelm royal defences, forcing Maroboduus to abandon his capital and seek refuge with remaining loyal supporters. The collapse of royal resistance occurred with startling rapidity as news of the capital's fall triggered widespread defections among previously loyal tribal units. Regional governors and allied chieftains who had supported royal authority quickly switched allegiance to avoid retribution from victorious rebels, creating cascading political collapse throughout the kingdom's administrative structure. Archaeological evidence shows hasty abandonment of royal administrative centres across the kingdom, with valuable documents and official regalia left behind during precipitous evacuation. Maroboduus's decision to seek Roman protection represented pragmatic recognition that continued resistance would result in complete destruction of his remaining supporters, while offering no realistic prospects for recovering royal authority. His flight to Roman territory during late 19 AD marked the end of centralised Marcomannic government and the collapse of the most sophisticated Germanic political entity north of the Danube. The king's exile to Ravenna under Roman protection provided personal security, while eliminating him as a factor in subsequent Germanic political developments. The fragmentation of the Marcomannic kingdom following Catualda's victory created immediate challenges for maintaining political stability and territorial integrity throughout the former royal territories. Without centralized administration and military coordination, individual tribal groups reverted to traditional governance structures while competing for control over valuable resources and strategic territories. The resulting political chaos created opportunities for external intervention as neighbouring powers sought to exploit Marcomannic weakness for territorial gain. Roman response to the kingdom's collapse involved careful diplomatic intervention designed to prevent emergence of new, unified Germanic threats while maintaining frontier stability along the Danube. Rather than attempting direct territorial occupation, which would have required substantial military resources and risked provoking broader Germanic resistance, Roman officials pursued divide-and-control strategies that installed client rulers capable of maintaining local order while preventing political reunification. This approach reflected sophisticated understanding of Germanic political dynamics and practical limitations of Roman military capabilities in Central European territories. The installation of Vangio and Sido as client rulers represented Roman attempts to maintain political control through cooperative Germanic leadership that could command local legitimacy while serving imperial interests. Both rulers possessed sufficient tribal connections and military capability to maintain order within their assigned territories, but lacked the resources and political support necessary for challenging Roman authority or reunifying the fragmented kingdom. Their appointments created competitive dynamics that prevented cooperation while ensuring continued dependence on Roman diplomatic support for maintaining local power. The political fragmentation that followed Catualda's victory created a power vacuum that would persist for nearly 4 decades, fundamentally altering the demographic and territorial landscape of Central Europe. The collapse of centralized Marcomannic authority triggered a cascade of tribal movements as various groups attempted to claim portions of the former kingdom's territories, while others fled the resulting chaos entirely. Archaeological evidence from Bohemian sites dating to 20–30 AD reveals widespread settlement abandonment, with many locations showing signs of hasty evacuation rather than gradual decline. Storage pits were left unsealed, valuable metalwork abandoned in workshops, and defensive fortifications deliberately dismantled, suggesting organised withdrawal rather than catastrophic destruction. The demographic upheaval extended far beyond the immediate participants in the civil war. Entire tribal segments that had prospered under Maroboduus' centralised system found themselves without protection or administrative support, forcing difficult decisions about whether to remain in ancestral territories or seek security elsewhere. Archaeological surveys across Moravia and western Slovakia document the abandonment of numerous settlements during this period, with distinctive Marcomannic pottery and metalwork disappearing from the archaeological record for several decades. The population displacement created ripple effects throughout Central Europe as refugee groups sought new territories, often triggering conflicts with established populations. Roman frontier commanders along the Danube reported increasing instability as displaced tribal groups pressed against provincial boundaries, seeking refuge or attempting to establish new territories. These movements created security challenges that required constant military vigilance, as Roman officials struggled to distinguish between genuine refugees and potential raiders exploiting the chaos for territorial gain. The situation demanded careful diplomatic management to prevent large-scale tribal invasions, while avoiding military commitments that might drain resources from other frontier sectors. The installation of Vangio and Sido as client rulers in 20 AD represented Rome's attempt to impose stability through controlled partition of the former kingdom's territories. Vangio received authority over the western regions, including much of Bohemia and adjacent areas, while Sido controlled eastern territories encompassing parts of Moravia and Slovakia. Both rulers possessed legitimate claims to leadership through kinship connections to pre-kingdom tribal hierarchies, providing them with sufficient local credibility to command obedience while lacking the resources necessary for challenging Roman authority or reunifying the divided territories. The partition arrangement required complex negotiations among multiple stakeholders, including Roman provincial administrators, surviving Marcomannic nobles, and representatives from various tribal groups claiming territorial rights. Roman diplomatic records, preserved in fragmentary inscriptions and later historical accounts, indicate that the negotiations involved detailed territorial demarcations, tribute obligations, and military cooperation agreements designed to prevent future conflicts while ensuring Roman strategic interests. The agreements established precedents for Roman client-state relationships that would influence frontier policy throughout the imperial period. Vangio's Western Kingdom encompassed the most economically valuable portions of the former Marcomannic territories, including the capital region and primary agricultural areas along the Elbe River system. His administration inherited remnants of Maroboduus's governmental infrastructure, including administrative buildings, storage facilities, and craft production centres that provided foundations for maintaining political authority. Archaeological excavations at sites near Prague reveal continuity in settlement patterns and material culture during the early years of Vangio's rule, suggesting successful preservation of existing economic and social structures despite the political upheaval. The Western Kingdom's military organisation retained elements of Maroboduus's reformed army, while adapting to reduced territorial extent and population base. Vangio commanded approximately 15,000 warriors, substantially fewer than the former kingdom's peak strength, but sufficient for maintaining internal order and fulfilling Roman military cooperation obligations. The force composition emphasized infantry units trained in Roman-influenced tactical formations, with reduced cavalry components reflecting the loss of horse-breeding territories in eastern regions. Standardized weapons production continued at reduced levels, maintaining quality while adapting to smaller-scale requirements. Sido's eastern territories faced greater challenges in establishing stable governance due to their peripheral position within the former kingdom and reduced access to established administrative infrastructure. The region's population included substantial numbers of non-Marcomannic tribal groups who had maintained distinct cultural identities under royal rule, creating ethnic tensions that complicated political unification. Archaeological evidence from eastern sites shows more dramatic changes in material culture during this period, with traditional Marcomannic pottery styles being replaced by diverse regional variants that reflected the area's cultural fragmentation. The Eastern Kingdom's economic base relied heavily on livestock production and mineral extraction, rather than the agricultural surplus that had supported Western territories. Iron ore deposits in the Carpathian foothills provided valuable resources for weapons production and trade, while extensive grazing lands supported cattle and horse breeding that supplied both local needs and export markets. However, the loss of centralized trade networks that had operated under royal administration reduced economic efficiency and limited access to distant markets that had previously generated substantial revenue. Military capabilities in the Eastern Kingdom reflected these economic constraints, with Sido commanding approximately 8,000 warriors equipped with locally produced weapons that maintained traditional Germanic design characteristics, rather than the standardized patterns developed under Maroboduus. The force structure emphasized cavalry units that exploited the region's horse-breeding capabilities, providing tactical advantages in the open terrain that characterized much of the eastern territories. Infantry formations retained Germanic fighting traditions while incorporating selected Roman tactical innovations that enhanced battlefield effectiveness without requiring extensive retraining. The partition's immediate consequences included renewed tribal movements, as various groups attempted to exploit the changed political landscape for territorial advantage. The Hermunduri, occupying territories along the Upper Elbe, expanded westward into former Marcomannic areas that had been depopulated during the Civil War. Archaeological evidence from sites in eastern Bohemia shows sudden appearance of Hermunduri material culture around 25 AD, indicating organised settlement rather than gradual cultural diffusion. These movements created border tensions with Vangio's kingdom that required Roman diplomatic intervention to prevent armed conflict. Similar territorial adjustments occurred throughout the region as the collapse of centralised authority eliminated the military deterrent that had previously maintained stable boundaries. The Lugi Confederation, based in territories between the Oder and Vistula rivers, expanded southward into former Marcomannic territories in Moravia, establishing settlements that controlled strategic river crossings and trade routes. The expansion brought Lugi forces into direct contact with Sido's kingdom, creating potential for conflict that threatened regional stability and Roman frontier security. Roman response to these territorial changes involved careful diplomatic management, designed to prevent major conflicts while ensuring that emerging power arrangements served imperial strategic interests. Provincial commanders along the Danube maintained regular communication with tribal leaders throughout the region, providing selective support to groups whose territorial claims aligned with Roman security requirements, while discouraging expansion that might threaten frontier stability. This diplomatic activity required sophisticated understanding of tribal relationships and territorial disputes that challenged Roman administrative capabilities. The gradual stabilization of territorial boundaries occurred through a series of localized agreements and military confrontations that established new equilibrium among competing tribal groups. The process extended over approximately 2 decades as various populations adjusted to changed political circumstances, while Roman diplomatic pressure encouraged peaceful resolution of disputes. Archaeological evidence suggests that most territorial changes were accomplished through negotiated settlement rather than large-scale warfare, indicating successful Roman intervention in preventing major conflicts. Economic disruption caused by political fragmentation had lasting consequences for trade networks and craft production throughout the region. The amber routes that had generated substantial revenue under centralized royal administration became fragmented among multiple competing authorities, reducing efficiency and increasing transportation costs. Roman merchants operating along these routes reported decreased security and higher expenses, leading to reduced trade volume and elimination of less profitable commercial activities. The disruption particularly affected luxury goods trade that had flourished under the kingdom's diplomatic arrangements with Rome. Craft production centres that had supplied standardised goods throughout the former kingdom faced severe challenges adapting to reduced market demand and fragmented distribution networks. Archaeological evidence from metalworking sites shows significant reduction in production volume during the decades following partition, with many workshops closing entirely while others shifted to local market production. The decline in specialised craft production reduced overall economic sophistication, while forcing communities to become more self-sufficient in basic manufactured goods. Agricultural production remained relatively stable despite political upheaval, as farming communities possessed sufficient local knowledge and resources to maintain food production without centralised coordination. However, the loss of royal administration eliminated systematic surplus collection and redistribution that had provided security during poor harvest years. Individual communities became more vulnerable to local crop failures while losing access to emergency food supplies that had previously been maintained through royal storage systems. The demographic recovery that began around 40 AD reflected gradual adaptation to new political realities as tribal populations established stable relationships with client rulers and neighbouring groups. Archaeological evidence shows renewed settlement activity in previously abandoned areas, with new communities often established at different locations from pre-Civil War sites. The settlement patterns reflected lessons learned during the period of instability, with greater emphasis on defensive positioning and diversified economic activities that reduced dependence on long-distance trade networks. Population movements during the recovery period included both returning refugees and new settlers attracted by available territories and economic opportunities. The mixing of different tribal groups created cultural synthesis that combined various Germanic traditions while adapting to local environmental conditions. Material culture from this period shows increasing regional variation as communities developed distinctive characteristics that reflected their particular demographic composition and economic specialization. The emergence of new leadership structures throughout the region represented significant departure from both traditional tribal organization and the centralized system that had existed under Maroboduus. Local chieftains gained authority through successful management of community resources and effective negotiation with external powers, rather than hereditary claims or royal appointment. This leadership evolution created more flexible political arrangements that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining sufficient stability for economic development. Roman frontier policy during this period evolved to accommodate the new political landscape while maintaining strategic objectives along the Danube boundary. The client-state arrangements with Vangio and Sido provided models for managing Germanic territories without direct military occupation, demonstrating that cooperative tribal leadership could serve Roman interests more effectively than hostile populations requiring constant military supervision. The success of these arrangements influenced subsequent Roman approaches to frontier management throughout the imperial period. Military cooperation between Roman forces and client rulers developed through regular joint operations against hostile tribal groups and coordination of defensive preparations along the Danube frontier. These activities provided Roman commanders with valuable intelligence about tribal movements and political developments, while giving client rulers access to Roman military expertise and logistical support. The cooperation created mutual dependencies that strengthened the client-state relationships while serving both parties' security interests. The gradual consolidation of political authority under client rulers created conditions for renewed economic development and territorial expansion during the mid-1st century AD. Both Vangio and Sido successfully established stable succession arrangements that provided continuity beyond their individual reigns, creating institutional foundations for long-term political stability. Archaeological evidence from the 50s and 60s AD shows increasing settlement density and improved material culture that reflected growing prosperity and security throughout the client territories. However, this apparent stability masked underlying tensions that would eventually contribute to renewed conflict with Rome. The client rulers' success in consolidating authority and rebuilding economic capabilities created growing confidence in their ability to pursue independent policies that might conflict with Roman strategic interests. Population growth and territorial expansion brought the client kingdoms into contact with hostile tribal groups further north and east, creating security challenges that strained existing military capabilities while generating pressure for alliance formation with other Germanic powers. The demographic pressures that would eventually trigger renewed conflict began building during the 80s and 90s AD, as population recovery reached levels that strained available agricultural resources within established territorial boundaries. Archaeological surveys document increasing settlement density throughout both client kingdoms, with new communities established in previously marginal lands that required more intensive cultivation techniques. The population growth reflected successful adaptation to post-kingdom political arrangements, but created resource competition that would eventually require territorial expansion or alternative solutions. Simultaneously, tribal movements in northern and eastern Europe began generating pressure against the client kingdom's boundaries as various groups sought new territories or fled conflicts in their traditional homelands. The Lugi Confederation experienced internal tensions that triggered southward migration pressure, while Sarmatian peoples from the Pontic steppes began expanding westward into territories previously controlled by Germanic tribes. These movements created a demographic cascade that would eventually reach Roman frontier zones, setting the stage for the conflicts that would define the later 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The mounting demographic pressures and territorial tensions that had been building throughout the client kingdoms during the late 1st century AD finally reached a critical threshold in 166 AD, when a massive confederation of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes launched coordinated assaults across the Danube frontier. The initial breakthrough occurred near modern-day Vienna, where Marcomannic forces, now reunified under aggressive leadership that rejected the client-state arrangements of previous decades, overwhelmed Roman border fortifications through sheer numerical superiority and tactical innovations that exploited weaknesses in frontier defensive systems. Archaeological evidence from destroyed Roman settlements along the Danube shows extensive burning and deliberate destruction dating to this period, with coin hoards hastily buried by fleeing civilians providing precise chronological markers for the invasion's devastating impact. The Marcomannic breakthrough represented far more than a typical barbarian raid across Roman frontiers. Unlike previous Germanic incursions that had typically consisted of opportunistic attacks by individual tribal groups seeking plunder and quick withdrawal, the 166 AD offensive involved coordinated planning among multiple tribal confederations that had spent years preparing for systematic territorial conquest. Roman intelligence reports, preserved in fragmentary military dispatches, describe Germanic forces numbering approximately 100,000 warriors organised into disciplined formations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Roman military weaknesses and logistical vulnerabilities. The invasion force included substantial Marcomannic contingents alongside Quadi warriors from Moravian territories, Sarmatian cavalry units from the Pannonian plains, and various smaller tribal groups that had been displaced by demographic pressures further north and east. This multi-ethnic composition reflected the complex political dynamics that had developed throughout Central Europe during the previous century, as population growth and resource competition forced traditional enemies to cooperate in pursuing territorial expansion at Roman expense. The Confederation's leadership structure combined Germanic war councils with Sarmatian military hierarchies, creating hybrid command systems that coordinated diverse tactical traditions while maintaining sufficient unity for sustained military operations. Roman frontier defences along the Middle Danube had been designed primarily to monitor tribal movements and prevent small-scale raiding rather than repel major invasions by organised confederations. The fortification system relied on a series of watchtowers and small garrison posts that could provide early warning of hostile activity, while channeling tribal movements toward larger fortress complexes capable of sustained defence. However, the sheer scale of the Germanic offensive overwhelmed these defensive arrangements, as simultaneous attacks at multiple crossing points prevented effective coordination among isolated garrison units. The breakthrough at Carnuntum, the primary Roman fortress controlling the Danube crossing near modern Vienna, occurred through coordinated assault that combined direct frontal attacks with flanking movements that exploited weaknesses in the fortress's defensive perimeter. Germanic forces had conducted detailed reconnaissance of Roman defensive positions during previous months, identifying vulnerable points in the fortification system while gathering intelligence about garrison strength and supply arrangements. The assault began with diversionary attacks that drew Roman defenders toward prepared positions, followed by concentrated assaults on weakened sections of the defensive perimeter. Archaeological excavations at Carnuntum have revealed extensive evidence of the fortress's destruction, including arrowheads embedded in wooden structures, scattered military equipment abandoned during the evacuation, and destruction layers containing burned grain stores and collapsed buildings. The evidence indicates that Roman resistance lasted several days before overwhelming Germanic numbers forced the garrison's withdrawal, allowing tribal forces to secure the crossing and establish forward bases for subsequent operations deeper into Roman territory. The immediate aftermath of the breakthrough saw Germanic forces spreading rapidly throughout the Pannonian provinces, with raiding columns penetrating as far south as the Italian Alps and as far west as the Rhine frontier. These deep penetration raids demonstrated sophisticated logistical planning that enabled tribal forces to maintain operational effectiveness across hundreds of kilometres of hostile territory. Archaeological evidence from destroyed Roman settlements throughout Austria and northern Italy shows consistent patterns of systematic plundering that targeted valuable goods while destroying infrastructure that might support Roman counteroffensives. The raiders' tactical methods reflected careful study of Roman military capabilities and civilian defensive preparations. Rather than conducting indiscriminate destruction, Germanic forces focused on eliminating Roman military installations, destroying communication networks, and capturing strategic resources while generally avoiding unnecessary conflict with civilian populations who offered no resistance. This selective approach maximized material gains while minimizing casualties that might reduce the Confederation's long-term military capabilities, indicating strategic thinking that extended beyond immediate plunder objectives. Roman civilian populations throughout the affected regions experienced unprecedented disruption as news of the Germanic breakthrough triggered widespread panic and mass evacuations. Archaeological evidence from villa sites in Austria and Slovenia shows hasty abandonment during this period, with valuable items buried in concealment pits, while buildings were left with doors standing open and storage areas partially emptied. The evacuation pattern suggests that Roman civilians had received advance warning of approaching tribal forces, allowing organised withdrawal rather than chaotic flight, though many communities lost substantial property and livestock during the evacuation process. The economic impact of the invasion extended far beyond the immediate war zone as disruption of trade networks and agricultural production created shortages throughout the Roman Empire's northern provinces. The amber routes that connected Baltic production areas with Mediterranean markets were completely severed, while iron production in Noricum ceased entirely as Germanic forces occupied mining districts. Archaeological evidence from Roman commercial centres shows dramatic reduction in luxury goods imports during this period, with pottery assemblages dominated by local production rather than the diverse international products that had characterised pre-war trade patterns. Marcus Aurelius received initial reports of the Germanic breakthrough while campaigning against Parthian forces in the eastern provinces, creating a strategic crisis that required immediate redeployment of military resources from multiple frontier sectors. The emperor's response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the invasion's strategic implications, as he recognized that Germanic success might encourage similar attacks by other hostile tribes throughout the empire's northern frontiers. His decision to abandon the Parthian campaign and concentrate imperial military resources against the Germanic threat reflected accurate assessment of the relative dangers facing Roman territorial integrity. The emperor's military response began with systematic reorganization of command structures along the Danube frontier, replacing provincial governors whose defensive preparations had proved inadequate with experienced military commanders capable of coordinating complex counteroffensive operations. Marcus Aurelius appointed Claudius Pompeianus, a seasoned general with extensive experience in Germanic warfare, as supreme commander of Danubian operations with authority over all military forces between the Rhine and Black Sea. This appointment centralized command authority, while providing the strategic coordination necessary for effective response to multi-front Germanic offensive operations. The establishment of new legionary commands along the Danube frontier represented fundamental reorganization of Roman military deployment in Central Europe. Rather than maintaining the previous system of dispersed garrison forces responsible for individual provincial sectors, Marcus Aurelius created concentrated army groups capable of conducting major offensive operations while maintaining sufficient strategic reserves for responding to unexpected threats. Archaeological evidence from Roman military sites shows massive construction projects during 168 AD, with existing fortresses expanded and new installations built to accommodate substantially increased troop concentrations. The Aduatuatrix and the Gemina legions were transferred from Rhine frontier duties to strengthen Danubian defences, while the newly formed 3 Italica Legion was stationed at Castra Regina to control the upper Danube crossing points. These deployments represented approximately 45,000 additional troops assigned to Germanic frontier operations, substantially increasing Roman military capabilities while creating integrated command structures that could coordinate operations across the entire frontier zone. The troop concentrations required extensive logistical preparations, including construction of new supply depots, road networks, and communication systems that enhanced operational effectiveness. Roman engineering capabilities proved crucial for establishing the infrastructure necessary for sustained military operations against Germanic forces. The construction of fortified camps, supply roads, and communication networks throughout the war zone demonstrated Roman organisational advantages that gradually shifted the strategic balance despite initial Germanic successes. Archaeological surveys along Roman military roads built during this period reveal sophisticated engineering techniques that enabled rapid troop movement and efficient supply distribution across difficult terrain, providing Roman forces with logistical advantages that Germanic tribal armies could not match. The systematic Roman response included establishment of forward operating bases that projected military power into Germanic territories while providing secure positions for launching counter-offensive operations. These installations, typically located on elevated terrain overlooking major river crossings or strategic passes, featured extensive fortifications designed to withstand siege warfare while housing sufficient supplies for extended defensive operations. Archaeological excavations at these sites revealed standardized construction techniques that enabled rapid deployment while maintaining defensive effectiveness against Germanic assault tactics. The major engagements that characterized the Roman counteroffensive began in earnest during 168 AD, when Marcus Aurelius personally assumed command of military operations along the Danube frontier. The emperor's presence provided crucial psychological advantages for Roman forces, while demonstrating imperial commitment to achieving decisive victory over Germanic Confederation forces. His strategic approach emphasized systematic reduction of Germanic territorial gains through coordinated offensive operations that exploited Roman advantages in siege warfare and logistical capabilities, while avoiding pitched battles that might favour Germanic numerical superiority. The Battle of Carnuntum in early 169 AD marked the first major Roman victory in the systematic campaign to restore frontier security. Roman forces, numbering approximately 35,000 legionaries and auxiliary troops, engaged a Germanic army of similar size that had established defensive positions around the captured fortress. The engagement demonstrated Roman tactical superiority in coordinated infantry operations, as disciplined legionary formations systematically dismantled Germanic defensive lines through coordinated assaults supported by artillery bombardment and cavalry flanking movements. Archaeological evidence from the Carnuntum battlefield reveals the extensive scale of the engagement and confirms Roman tactical advantages in equipment and organisation. Weapons deposits recovered from the site include large quantities of Roman pylon points and Germanic spearheads, indicating sustained close combat fighting that favoured Roman training and equipment standardisation. The distribution patterns of artefacts across the battlefield suggest that Germanic forces maintained organised resistance for several hours before their defensive positions collapsed under sustained Roman pressure. The victory at Carnuntum enabled Roman forces to re-establish control over the primary Danube crossing, while severing Germanic supply lines that had supported deep penetration raids into Roman territory. The fortress's recapture required extensive reconstruction efforts that demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities and logistical organisation. Archaeological excavations reveal systematic rebuilding during 169-170 AD, with improved defensive features that incorporated lessons learned during the Germanic siege, while maintaining the strategic advantages that made Carnuntum crucial for frontier control. Subsequent Roman operations focused on systematic elimination of Germanic strongholds throughout the occupied territories, with each campaign designed to reduce Confederation military capabilities while restoring Roman territorial control. The Siege of Laugerizio in 170 AD demonstrated Roman advantages in sustained siege warfare, as legionary engineers constructed elaborate circumvallation works that prevented Germanic relief efforts while maintaining Roman supply lines. The siege lasted approximately 4 months before Germanic defenders agreed to surrender terms that required evacuation of Roman territories and provision of hostages to ensure compliance with peace agreements. During the siege operations of 172 AD, Roman forces experienced severe supply difficulties due to extended drought conditions that reduced water availability throughout the campaign zone. The crisis reached critical proportions when Germanic forces attempted to exploit Roman logistical vulnerabilities by attacking supply convoys and destroying water sources behind Roman lines. Archaeological evidence from Roman camps during this period shows emergency water storage facilities and evidence of rationing systems that maintained minimal supply levels while Roman engineers searched for reliable water sources. The famous rain miracle occurred during Marcus Aurelius's campaign against the Quadi, when sudden thunderstorms provided crucial water supplies to Roman forces facing severe dehydration in the Moravian plains. Contemporary accounts describe the dramatic psychological impact of the unexpected rainfall, which Roman soldiers interpreted as divine intervention supporting their military efforts. The event's significance extended beyond immediate tactical advantages, as news of the miracle spread throughout Roman territories and provided powerful propaganda that enhanced imperial prestige while demonstrating divine approval for the Germanic campaigns. Germanic morale suffered correspondingly as reports of Roman divine favour circulated among tribal populations already experiencing military defeats and territorial losses. The Confederation's religious leaders struggled to provide alternative explanations for the apparent divine support enjoyed by Roman forces, creating internal tensions that weakened tribal unity and reduced military effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from Germanic religious sites shows increased ritual activity during this period, including weapon sacrifices and elaborate ceremonies designed to regain divine favour, but these efforts failed to restore confidence in ultimate victory against Roman forces. The psychological impact of the rain miracle extended throughout both Roman and Germanic societies, influencing military morale and civilian support for continued warfare. Roman forces interpreted the event as confirmation of their ultimate victory, encouraging aggressive tactical approaches and sustained offensive operations despite logistical challenges. Germanic warriors, conversely, began questioning their leadership's assurances of divine support while experiencing growing doubt about their confederation's ability to achieve lasting territorial gains against Roman military capabilities. The systematic Roman counteroffensive that followed the rain miracle gradually compressed Germanic forces into increasingly untenable positions throughout the occupied territories, forcing tribal leadership to confront the reality that their initial breakthrough advantages had been decisively neutralized by superior Roman organization and logistical capabilities. By late 174 AD, the Confederation's military situation had deteriorated to the point where continued resistance threatened complete annihilation of their warrior populations, while Roman forces maintained relentless pressure through coordinated operations that prevented Germanic forces from establishing defensible positions or securing reliable supply lines. Archaeological evidence from Germanic camps abandoned during this period shows hasty evacuation with valuable weapons and personal equipment left behind, indicating the desperate circumstances that forced tribal armies to prioritize speed over material preservation during their retreat toward the Danube frontier. The collapse of Germanic resistance accelerated during 175 AD when internal disputes within the Confederation leadership created fatal divisions that prevented coordinated defensive planning. The Marcomannic war chiefs, who had initially provided unified command for the invasion force, found themselves increasingly isolated as allied tribal groups began negotiating separate peace arrangements with Roman commanders. The Sarmatian cavalry units, whose mobility had provided crucial tactical advantages during the initial breakthrough operations, withdrew from joint operations to protect their own territorial holdings along the Pannonian plains. Archaeological evidence from former Confederation camps shows distinct phases of abandonment, with Sarmatian horse equipment disappearing from sites several months before Germanic infantry gear, confirming the chronological sequence of Allied withdrawals. Roman diplomatic efforts during this period demonstrated sophisticated understanding of tribal political dynamics, as imperial negotiators successfully exploited existing tensions within the Confederation to accelerate its disintegration. Marcus Aurelius authorized selective amnesty arrangements for tribal groups willing to abandon the Confederation and accept tributary status, creating powerful incentives for defection while isolating the most determined resistance elements. These negotiations required careful balance between demonstrating Roman clemency toward cooperative tribes and maintaining sufficient military pressure to prevent renewed Confederation unity, a diplomatic challenge that tested imperial administrative capabilities throughout the concluding phases of the conflict. The Quadi leadership proved most receptive to Roman peace overtures, as their territorial positions in Moravia made them particularly vulnerable to Roman retaliation, while offering limited strategic value for continued resistance. Their negotiations with Claudius Pompeianus during the winter of 175-176 AD established precedents for the peace arrangements that would eventually encompass the entire region. Archaeological evidence from Quadi settlements during this period shows rapid transition from military to civilian priorities, with weapon caches being converted to agricultural tool storage and defensive fortifications being partially dismantled to demonstrate peaceful intentions to Roman observers. The final Marcomannic resistance collapsed in early 177 AD when sustained Roman pressure eliminated the last strongholds capable of supporting organised military operations. The decisive engagement occurred near the confluence of the Morava and Danube rivers, where approximately 8,000 Marcomannic warriors made their final stand against overwhelming Roman forces numbering nearly 25,000 legionaries and auxiliaries. The battle demonstrated the complete transformation of tactical advantages that had occurred during the extended conflict, as Roman forces systematically dismantled Germanic defensive positions through coordinated artillery bombardment followed by disciplined infantry assaults that prevented effective Germanic counterattacks. Archaeological excavations at the battlefield site reveal the extensive scale of Germanic casualties, with mass burial pits containing hundreds of warrior skeletons showing evidence of wounds consistent with Roman military equipment. The skeletal remains display high frequencies of trauma from gladi thrusts and pilum impacts, indicating that Germanic forces maintained close combat resistance despite hopeless tactical circumstances. Personal ornaments and weapons recovered from the burials demonstrate that the final resistance included elite Marcomannic warriors who chose death over surrender, reflecting the cultural values that had sustained Germanic military traditions throughout the prolonged conflict. The death of Marcus Aurelius at Vindobona in March 180 AD occurred just as final peace negotiations were reaching conclusion, creating a critical transition moment that would determine the ultimate terms imposed upon defeated Germanic populations. The emperor's son, Commodus, who assumed imperial authority with limited military experience and different strategic priorities, proved more interested in concluding the Germanic campaigns quickly than in implementing the systematic territorial annexation that Marcus Aurelius had apparently been planning. This shift in imperial policy had profound consequences for the final peace arrangements. As Commodus prioritized immediate stability over long-term strategic advantages that might have fundamentally altered the demographic balance along the Danube frontier. Commodus's peace terms, negotiated during the summer of 180 AD, reflected his desire to achieve rapid conflict resolution, while avoiding the administrative burdens associated with governing newly conquered Germanic territories. Rather than implementing direct Roman rule over defeated tribal lands, the emperor established tributary relationships that maintained nominal tribal autonomy while ensuring Roman strategic control through hostage arrangements and military service obligations. The agreements required Marcomannic and Quadi leadership to provide annual tribute payments, surrender designated numbers of warriors for Roman auxiliary service, and accept permanent Roman garrisons at strategic locations throughout their territories. The tribute obligations imposed substantial economic burdens on defeated tribal populations, requiring annual payments that included livestock, agricultural products, manufactured goods, and precious metals totaling approximately 1/3 of estimated tribal production capacity. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements during the immediate post-war period shows significant changes in material culture that reflect these economic pressures, with luxury goods disappearing from household assemblages while basic pottery and metalwork display reduced quality and standardization. The tribute system effectively extracted Germanic economic surplus for Roman benefit, while maintaining sufficient local resources to prevent complete economic collapse that might trigger renewed rebellion. Military service obligations required Germanic tribes to provide approximately 13,000 warriors annually for Roman auxiliary units, representing a significant proportion of their total military-age male population. These levies served multiple Roman strategic objectives, removing potential military threats from Germanic territories while providing experienced warriors for frontier defense and imperial military operations throughout the empire. The systematic recruitment created demographic pressures within Germanic communities as young men were removed from agricultural and craft production activities, forcing adaptation of traditional economic patterns to accommodate reduced male labour availability. The forced resettlement programs implemented as part of the peace arrangements represented the most dramatic demographic intervention in Germanic society during this period. Commodus authorized the relocation of approximately 40,000 Marcomannic and Quadi civilians to designated areas within Roman provinces, primarily along the Danube frontier, where they could provide agricultural labour while serving as human buffers against future tribal incursions. Archaeological evidence from these settlement areas shows the establishment of distinctive Germanic communities that maintained cultural traditions while adapting to Roman legal and administrative systems. The resettlement sites, located primarily in Pannonia and Noricum, featured planned village layouts that combined Roman urban planning principles with Germanic architectural traditions. Excavations at sites near modern Sombertheli and Klagenfurt reveal rectangular timber-framed houses arranged along straight streets, with central areas designated for community gatherings and craft production. The settlements included Roman-style public buildings such as bathhouses and administrative centres, indicating systematic efforts to integrate Germanic populations into provincial society while maintaining their distinct cultural identity. Germanic auxiliary units formed from resettled populations served throughout the Roman Empire during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, with archaeological evidence of their service appearing in Britain, North Africa, and Eastern Frontier provinces. Military equipment recovered from Germanic auxiliary camps displays hybrid characteristics that combine traditional Germanic weapon designs with Roman standardization requirements, reflecting the cultural adaptation process that occurred as tribal warriors integrated into imperial military structures. Inscriptions from auxiliary tombstones provide personal details about individual Germanic soldiers, revealing their origins, service records, and family relationships that demonstrate successful integration into Roman military society. The gradual adoption of Roman customs among Germanic communities occurred through multiple channels, including military service, economic interaction, and administrative integration that exposed tribal populations to Roman cultural practices and legal systems. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements within Roman provinces shows increasing adoption of Roman-style pottery, architectural techniques, and burial practices during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. The cultural transformation proceeded gradually, with traditional Germanic elements persisting alongside Roman innovations, rather than being completely replaced by imperial customs. Roman legal practices gradually penetrated Germanic communities through administrative necessity and economic advantage, as tribal populations discovered that Roman legal procedures provided more effective resolution of disputes and commercial transactions than traditional Germanic customs. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements includes Roman-style legal documents written on wooden tablets, indicating adoption of Roman administrative practices for recording property transfers, commercial agreements, and judicial decisions. The legal integration process created hybrid systems that combined Roman procedural efficiency with Germanic cultural values and social structures. The introduction of Christianity among Germanic populations began during the early 3rd century through contact with Roman military personnel and civilian administrators who brought Christian beliefs and practices into tribal communities. Archaeological evidence for early Christian influence appears in Germanic burial sites, where traditional grave goods are replaced by Christian symbols and burial orientations that reflect Christian theological beliefs about death and resurrection. The religious transformation proceeded slowly and incompletely, with many Germanic communities maintaining traditional religious practices alongside Christian observances for several generations. Roman villa construction in former Germanic territories represented systematic colonization efforts that transformed the regional landscape while providing economic opportunities for both Roman colonists and Germanic labourers. Archaeological surveys throughout Austria and western Slovakia document the establishment of numerous villa complexes during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, featuring characteristic Roman architectural elements, including hypocaust heating systems, mosaic floors, and elaborate bath facilities. The villas served as administrative centres for agricultural estates that employed Germanic labour while introducing Roman farming techniques and crop varieties to the region. The villa complexes typically encompass several hundred hectares of agricultural land organised according to Roman estate management principles, with specialised areas for grain production, livestock breeding, and craft manufacturing that supplied both local needs and distant markets. Archaeological evidence from villa sites shows systematic drainage projects, road construction, and field boundary systems that transform the natural landscape according to Roman agricultural practices. Germanic workers employed on these estates learned Roman farming techniques while maintaining traditional knowledge that proved valuable for adapting Mediterranean agricultural methods to Central European environmental conditions. Roman-style burial practices gradually replaced traditional Germanic cremation ceremonies as tribal populations adopted Roman cultural values and legal systems that emphasized individual identity and family relationships over clan-based social organization. Archaeological excavations of Germanic cemeteries dating to the 3rd century reveal increasing adoption of Roman inhumation practices, with bodies buried in wooden coffins accompanied by personal ornaments and household items that reflect Roman material culture. The burial orientation typically followed Christian practices, with heads positioned toward the west, indicating religious transformation alongside cultural adaptation. The grave goods included in these burials demonstrate the material prosperity that some Germanic families achieved through successful integration into Roman provincial society. Archaeological assemblages include Roman pottery, bronze vessels, glass beads, and occasionally coins that indicate participation in monetized economic systems, rather than traditional barter arrangements. The quality and quantity of grave goods vary significantly among individual burials, reflecting the social differentiation that developed within Germanic communities as some families achieved greater success in adapting to Roman economic opportunities. Archaeological evidence of cultural transformation extends beyond individual settlements to encompass regional landscape changes that reflect systematic Roman territorial organisation and resource exploitation. Survey data from former Marcomannic territories shows establishment of Roman-style road networks, mining operations, and urban centres that integrated the region into imperial economic and administrative systems. The infrastructure development required substantial labour investments that provided employment opportunities for Germanic populations, while creating permanent changes to the regional environment and settlement patterns. The transformation of Germanic communities under Roman influence created conditions that would ultimately contribute to the broader crisis engulfing the empire during the turbulent 3rd century AD. As traditional tribal structures adapted to Roman administrative systems and economic pressures, the Marcomanni found themselves increasingly integrated into imperial military and political networks that drew them into conflicts extending far beyond their ancestral territories. The auxiliary units formed from Marcomannic warriors served in campaigns throughout the empire, from the Rhine frontier to the eastern provinces, gaining exposure to diverse military traditions and political developments that would profoundly influence their understanding of Roman power and its vulnerabilities. During the crisis of the 3rd century, which began in earnest around 235 AD with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander, the Roman Empire experienced unprecedented political instability that created opportunities for Germanic intervention in imperial affairs. The rapid succession of short-lived emperors, combined with simultaneous military pressures along multiple frontiers and severe economic disruption caused by currency debasement and trade disruption, weakened Roman military capabilities precisely when Germanic populations were achieving their greatest military sophistication through decades of service in Roman auxiliary forces. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements during this period shows increased weapons production and the appearance of Roman military equipment in civilian contexts, suggesting systematic preparation for renewed military activities. The Marcomanni's participation in anti-Roman coalitions during this period reflected their strategic calculation that imperial weakness provided unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion and political independence. Unlike their ancestors' desperate resistance during the Marcomannic Wars, the 3rd century Germanic leadership possessed detailed knowledge of Roman military organisation, logistical systems, and political vulnerabilities gained through extensive service in imperial armies. Former auxiliary officers who had returned to tribal territories brought sophisticated understanding of Roman strategic planning, siege warfare techniques, and the coordination required for large-scale military operations against fortified positions. The coalition that emerged during the 240 SAD included not only traditional Germanic tribal groups, but also incorporated Sarmatian cavalry units, Gothic infantry formations, and various smaller tribal contingents that had been displaced by demographic pressures from the east. This multi-ethnic military alliance demonstrated organisational sophistication that exceeded previous Germanic confederations, with coordinated command structures that allocated specific tactical roles to different tribal groups based on their particular military specialisations. Archaeological evidence from coalition camps along the Danube frontier reveals standardized fortification techniques and supply distribution systems that indicate centralized planning and resource coordination across diverse tribal populations. The initial breakthrough operations conducted by this coalition in 248 AD overwhelmed Roman frontier defences through simultaneous attacks at multiple crossing points along the Danube, preventing effective Roman response coordination while creating multiple penetration routes into imperial territory. The attacks demonstrated tactical innovations that exploited weaknesses in Roman defensive arrangements, particularly the coalition's use of diversionary assaults that drew Roman reserves away from primary attack zones, while main assault forces concentrated overwhelming numerical superiority against weakened defensive positions. Archaeological excavations at destroyed Roman frontier posts show evidence of coordinated assault techniques that combine direct frontal attacks with flanking movements designed to collapse defensive perimeters through multiple simultaneous pressures. Roman military responses during this period were severely hampered by the political chaos that prevented effective strategic coordination between provincial commanders and imperial authorities. The competing claims of rival emperors created divided loyalties among frontier armies, while economic crisis reduced the resources available for maintaining adequate garrison strength along threatened frontiers. Archaeological evidence from Roman military installations shows reduced maintenance activities and incomplete construction projects during the 250 SAD, indicating the resource constraints that weakened Roman defensive capabilities precisely when Germanic military pressure reached unprecedented levels. The penetration raids conducted by Germanic coalitions during this period extended deep into Roman provincial territories, with archaeological evidence of destruction appearing at sites hundreds of kilometres from the Danube frontier. Unlike earlier Germanic incursions that had focused primarily on portable wealth and rapid withdrawal, these campaigns demonstrated systematic territorial objectives that included the establishment of permanent bases within Roman provinces. Excavations at sites in modern Austria and northern Italy revealed Germanic fortifications built using Roman engineering techniques, indicating plans for sustained occupation rather than temporary raiding activities. The demographic pressures that drove Germanic expansion during this period originated from massive population movements occurring throughout northern and eastern Europe, as Gothic tribes migrating westward from their traditional territories along the Black Sea coast displaced established Germanic populations throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from sites in modern Poland and eastern Germany shows widespread settlement abandonment during the mid-3rd century, with distinctive material culture assemblages indicating the westward movement of substantial population groups seeking new territories. These migrations created a demographic cascade that eventually reached the Roman frontier, where displaced populations sought either new settlement areas or opportunities for military service that could provide economic security. The Gothic expansion represented a fundamental transformation of the demographic and political landscape throughout Central and Eastern Europe, as these highly organised tribal confederations possessed military capabilities that exceeded those of established Germanic groups while maintaining sufficient political cohesion to coordinate large-scale territorial conquests. Archaeological evidence from Gothic settlement sites shows sophisticated urban planning and craft production capabilities that indicate advanced social organisation, while their burial practices reveal military hierarchies and wealth accumulation that demonstrate successful territorial expansion and resource control. The Gothic military system combined traditional Germanic warrior culture with organisational innovations that enabled coordination of multiple tribal groups under centralised command structures. The pressure exerted by eastward-moving Gothic populations forced traditional Marcomannic communities to make difficult strategic choices regarding their territorial holdings and political alliances. Archaeological evidence from Bohemian sites during the mid-3rd century shows significant population movements as established communities abandoned ancestral territories rather than face incorporation into Gothic political systems or potential military conquest. The abandonment patterns suggest organised evacuation rather than chaotic flight, with valuable items carefully buried for potential future recovery, while community infrastructure was deliberately destroyed to prevent Gothic utilisation. Some Marcomannic groups chose integration with Gothic confederations, accepting subordinate status within larger political entities in exchange for protection and participation in successful military campaigns against Roman territories. Archaeological evidence for this integration appears in material culture assemblages that combine traditional Marcomannic pottery and metalwork styles with Gothic decorative elements and technological innovations. The cultural synthesis created hybrid traditions that maintained Germanic identity while adapting to new political and military circumstances that required cooperation with formerly hostile tribal groups. Other Marcomannic populations pursued westward migration toward territories controlled by the Alemanni Confederation, which was simultaneously expanding its influence throughout the Upper Rhine region and southwestern Germany. The Alemannic political system offered attractive alternatives to Gothic domination, as their confederation maintained greater internal autonomy for member tribes while providing effective military coordination for territorial expansion and defence against Roman counterattacks. Archaeological evidence from Alemannic territories shows the appearance of distinctive Marcomannic material culture elements during the later 3rd century, indicating successful integration of refugee populations into existing tribal structures. The integration process with Alemannic confederations required complex negotiations regarding territorial allocations, military service obligations, and political representation within confederation decision-making structures. Archaeological evidence suggests that Marcomannic groups typically received designated settlement areas within existing Alemannic territories, rather than maintaining separate tribal territories, indicating their acceptance of subordinate status within the larger confederation. However, material culture evidence shows that Marcomannic communities maintained distinctive cultural practices and craft production traditions, suggesting successful negotiation of arrangements that preserved cultural identity while accepting political integration. The military contributions that Marcomannic warriors provided to Alemannic Confederation forces proved particularly valuable during the extensive campaigns conducted against Roman territories throughout Gaul and northern Italy during the 260s and 270s AD. Former Roman auxiliary officers among the Marcomannic refugees brought crucial knowledge of Roman military organisation and tactical methods that enhanced Alemannic military effectiveness against imperial forces. Archaeological evidence from Alemannic military camps shows the adoption of Roman-influenced fortification techniques and supply organisation methods that reflect this transferred military expertise. The broader Germanic migrations of the 4th century AD encompassed the Marcomannic populations within massive demographic movements that fundamentally transformed the ethnic and political landscape of Western Europe. The Hunnic expansion westward from the Pontic steppes created irresistible pressure that forced virtually all Germanic tribal groups to abandon their traditional territories and seek new homelands within or beyond Roman provincial boundaries. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Central Europe shows widespread abandonment during the late 4th century, with entire regional populations disappearing from the archaeological record as they joined the massive migration streams flowing toward Western Europe and the Mediterranean region. The Marcomannic participation in these migrations occurred primarily through their integration with larger tribal confederations, rather than as independent political entities, reflecting the demographic and political fragmentation that had characterized their communities since the 3rd century crisis. Archaeological evidence suggests that former Marcomannic populations contributed to multiple migration streams, with some groups joining Visigothic movements toward Gaul and Spain, while others became incorporated into Vandal confederations that eventually reached North Africa. The dispersal across such extensive geographic areas effectively ended any possibility of maintaining distinct Marcomannic political or cultural identity. Roman sources from the late 4th and early 5th centuries increasingly refer to former Marcomannic territories using geographic rather than ethnic designations, indicating the complete dissolution of recognizable tribal political structures in these regions. Administrative documents from this period describe the establishment of Roman defensive positions and settlement colonies in areas that had previously been identified with specific Germanic tribal groups, suggesting that demographic displacement had created territorial vacuums that Roman authorities attempted to fill through systematic colonization efforts. Archaeological evidence from these colonization sites shows the construction of Roman-style fortifications and civilian settlements that indicate permanent imperial territorial expansion into formerly Germanic regions. The final historical mentions of identifiably Marcomannic populations appear in chronicles describing the establishment of Germanic kingdoms within former Roman provincial territories during the 5th century AD. These references typically describe small groups or individual leaders claiming Marcomannic ancestry, while serving within the administrative or military hierarchies of Visigothic, Vandal, or other Germanic royal courts. The scattered nature of these references suggests that Marcomannic identity had become primarily genealogical rather than political, maintained by individuals and families who preserved ancestral memories while participating fully in the new political structures that emerged from the collapse of Roman imperial authority in Western Europe. Archaeological evidence for the dissolution of distinct Marcomannic cultural identity appears in the material culture record through the gradual disappearance of characteristic pottery styles, metalwork techniques, and burial practices that had previously distinguished Marcomannic communities from neighbouring Germanic groups. Sites dating to the 5th and 6th centuries AD in former Marcomannic territories show material culture assemblages that reflect regional rather than tribal characteristics, indicating the emergence of new cultural identities based on geographic proximity and political affiliation rather than ancestral tribal connections. The transformation represents the completion of a process that had begun during the 3rd century crisis and continued through the massive demographic upheavals of the migration period. The linguistic evidence for Marcomannic cultural dissolution appears in the disappearance of distinctive dialectical features that had previously characterized their Germanic language variety. Comparative analysis of Germanic language development suggests that former Marcomannic linguistic elements became absorbed into broader regional dialects that reflected the mixed populations created by migration and resettlement processes. The linguistic integration paralleled the material culture changes documented through archaeological evidence, indicating comprehensive cultural transformation that eliminated the distinctive characteristics that had previously defined Marcomannic identity. The linguistic integration paralleled the material culture changes documented through archaeological evidence, indicating comprehensive cultural transformation that eliminated the distinctive characteristics that had previously defined Marcomannic identity. This dissolution of tribal distinctiveness marked the end of the Marcomanni as a recognizable political and cultural entity, though their legacy would persist through multiple channels that continue to influence our understanding of Germanic-Roman interaction and early European development. Archaeological preservation of Marcomannic culture has become increasingly sophisticated through systematic excavations and museum curation efforts throughout the Czech Republic and Austria. The National Museum in Prague houses one of the world's most comprehensive collections of Marcomannic artifacts, including the spectacular grave goods discovered at Musov in southern Moravia during the 1980s. This burial assemblage, dating to the late 1st century AD, contains a complete set of warrior equipment, including a pattern-welded sword with silver inlay work, an iron spearhead with bronze socket decoration, and a shield boss featuring intricate geometric patterns that demonstrate the highest levels of Marcomannic metalworking craftsmanship. The grave also yielded Roman imports including a bronze wine service and glass vessels that illustrate the diplomatic and economic relationships that characterized Maroboduus's kingdom at its height. The ongoing excavations at Starhradisco near Prostejov have revealed extensive evidence of Marcomannic settlement organisation and daily life that provides crucial insights into their social structure and economic activities. The site encompasses approximately 40 hectares of well-preserved settlement remains dating from the 1st century BC through the 2nd century AD, making it one of the largest continuously occupied Germanic sites in Central Europe. Excavations have uncovered over 200 individual structures, including residential buildings, craft workshops, storage facilities, and what appears to be a central administrative complex that may have served governmental functions during the kingdom period. The pottery assemblages from different occupation phases show clear stylistic evolution that reflects changing political circumstances and cultural influences, while the metalworking debris indicates systematic weapons production that supplied both local needs and export markets. Recent excavations at Bratislava Castle have uncovered substantial evidence of Marcomannic occupation during the early centuries AD, including defensive fortifications and residential structures that demonstrate the strategic importance of this Danube crossing point. The archaeological team led by Matej Rutkai has identified multiple construction phases that correspond to different periods of Marcomannic political development, from initial settlement establishment through the kingdom period and subsequent Roman client-state arrangements. The site has yielded exceptional preservation of organic materials, including leather goods, wooden tools, and textile fragments that provide rare insights into daily life aspects typically lost from archaeological sites. Particularly significant are the wooden writing tablets discovered in waterlogged deposits, which preserve Germanic runic inscriptions that represent some of the earliest examples of indigenous literacy among Central European tribal populations. The Naturhistorisches Museum in Vienna maintains extensive collections of Marcomannic artifacts recovered from sites throughout Austria, with particular strength in military equipment and personal ornaments that illustrate the warrior culture that defined Marcomannic society. The museum's research program has conducted systematic analysis of metalworking techniques used in Marcomannic weapon production, revealing sophisticated understanding of iron metallurgy that produced blades comparable in quality to contemporary Roman military equipment. X-ray analysis of sword blades has revealed complex pattern welding techniques that combined different iron alloys to create weapons with hard cutting edges and flexible cores, demonstrating metallurgical knowledge that required generations of specialized training to perfect. The influence of Marcomannic military and political traditions on later Germanic tribal formations appears most clearly in the organizational structures adopted by the Alemannic Confederation during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. Archaeological evidence from Alemannic sites shows adoption of fortification techniques and settlement planning principles that directly parallel methods developed during Maroboduus's kingdom, suggesting that former Marcomannic populations transmitted their governmental and military expertise to their new political affiliations. The Alemannic military system incorporated elements of the standardized equipment production and coordinated tactical formations that had characterized Marcomannic forces, creating hybrid military traditions that combined multiple Germanic influences with Roman organizational principles learned through auxiliary service. The transmission of Marcomannic political concepts influenced the development of early medieval Germanic kingdoms through former tribal members who achieved positions of authority within Visigothic, Vandal, and other royal administrations. Chronicle sources from the 6th and 7th centuries reference individuals claiming Marcomannic ancestry who served as military commanders and administrative officials in these kingdoms, bringing organizational experience that contributed to the sophisticated governmental structures that characterize successful Germanic successor states. The legal codes developed by these kingdoms show evidence of Germanic customary law traditions that include elements traceable to Marcomannic judicial practices, particularly regarding property rights and military service obligations that reflect the tributary systems originally developed under Roman client-state arrangements. The impact of Marcomannic resistance on Roman frontier policy extended far beyond the immediate military consequences of their conflicts with imperial forces. The Marcomannic Wars demonstrated that Germanic tribal confederations could pose existential threats to Roman territorial integrity when they achieved sufficient political unity and military organization, forcing fundamental reassessment of frontier defensive strategies throughout the imperial period. The Roman response involved systematic development of client-state relationships that sought to prevent the emergence of unified Germanic threats while maintaining territorial security through cooperative tribal leadership rather than direct military occupation of hostile territories. The Danubian defensive strategies developed during and after the Marcomannic Wars established precedents for frontier management that influenced imperial administration throughout subsequent centuries. The integration of Germanic auxiliary forces into Roman military structures reflected lessons learned about the effectiveness of tribal military traditions when properly coordinated with Roman tactical discipline and logistical capabilities. Archaeological evidence from Roman frontier installations shows systematic adaptation of defensive architecture to accommodate the specific tactical methods employed by Germanic Confederation forces, including modifications to gate systems and wall construction that reflected detailed understanding of Germanic siege warfare capabilities. The diplomatic protocols established through Roman negotiations with Maroboduus and subsequent Marcomannic leadership created institutional frameworks for managing relationships with powerful tribal entities that served as models for similar arrangements throughout the empire's northern frontiers. The tributary arrangements, hostage exchanges, and military cooperation agreements developed during these negotiations provided templates for frontier diplomacy that balance Roman strategic requirements with tribal political autonomy in ways that proved sustainable over extended periods. The success of these diplomatic innovations influenced Roman policy toward other major tribal confederations, including the Alemanni along the Rhine and various Gothic groups along the lower Danube. Modern historical interpretation of the Marcomanni has evolved significantly as archaeological evidence has provided more nuanced understanding of their political sophistication and cultural achievements. Earlier historical narratives that portrayed them primarily as barbarian raiders threatening Roman civilization have been replaced by recognition of their role as political innovators who created some of the most advanced governmental institutions in pre-medieval Europe. Contemporary scholarship emphasizes their contributions to the development of Germanic political organization and their influence on the evolution of Romano-Germanic diplomatic relationships that shaped the transition from classical antiquity to the early medieval period. The Marcomanni's place in the broader narrative of Germanic-Roman interaction illustrates the complex processes of cultural exchange and political adaptation that characterized frontier relationships throughout the imperial period. Rather than representing simple opposition between civilized Romans and barbarian Germans, their history demonstrates the sophisticated diplomatic and military interactions that created hybrid cultural forms combining elements from both traditions. Archaeological evidence shows that these cultural syntheses produced innovations in governmental organization, military technology, and economic systems that influenced subsequent European development in ways that extended far beyond the immediate participants in these interactions. The ethnogenesis processes that characterized early European development appear clearly in Marcomannic history through their transformation from traditional tribal organization to centralized kingdom and subsequent integration into larger confederation structures. Their experience illustrates how demographic pressures, military conflicts, and political opportunities combined to create new forms of political identity that transcended traditional tribal boundaries, while maintaining cultural elements that provided continuity with ancestral traditions. The Marcomannic example demonstrates that ethnic identity in early Europe was fluid and adaptive rather than fixed, changing in response to political circumstances while preserving selected cultural elements that maintained group cohesion across generations. The archaeological record of Marcomannic culture provides crucial evidence for understanding the material conditions that supported political innovation and cultural development among Germanic populations during the Roman period. Their settlements show evidence of economic specialization, craft production standardization, and trade network participation that created the material foundations necessary for supporting centralized political institutions and professional military forces. The quality and sophistication of their material culture demonstrates that Germanic societies possessed the technological capabilities and organizational skills necessary for creating complex political entities that could compete effectively with Roman imperial power when circumstances permitted unified action. The Marcomanni ultimately represent one of the most significant examples of Germanic political development during the Roman period, demonstrating both the potential for tribal societies to create sophisticated governmental institutions and the challenges they faced in maintaining political unity against external pressures and internal divisions. Their history provides essential insights into the processes of cultural change and political adaptation that characterize the transition from classical antiquity to medieval Europe. While their archaeological remains continue to yield new information about daily life, technological capabilities, and cultural values in pre-medieval Germanic society. Though they disappeared as a distinct political entity during the Great Migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries AD, their legacy persists in the institutional innovations, cultural traditions, and historical precedents that influenced the development of early medieval European civilization. The Marcomanni's story thus concludes not with simple extinction, but with transformation and integration into the broader currents of European history that they had helped to shape through their centuries of political innovation, military achievement, and cultural adaptation.